The story of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency is one of the most unsettling and revealing tales in American history. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of an idealistic immigrant chasing order and justice who helped create a private army in the shadows. From its humble beginnings, with one man on a lonely riverbank in 1850, it grew into a force so vast that the United States government itself had to step in and say, enough. At the very beginning stood Alan Pinkerton, a Scottish cooper turned abolitionist who claimed to stumble on a counterfeiter's camp while cutting wood near Chicago. That chance discovery, and the railroad contracts that followed, birthed an agency whose all-seeing eye and motto, "We never sleep," promised protection in a world that felt increasingly dangerous. The world was changing. Railroads stitched the continent together. Fortunes exploded overnight, and the old ways were dying beneath the weight of steel, steam, and speculation. Across half a century, the Pinkertons became the living embodiment of that transformation. In the Civil War, Pinkerton men guarded Abraham Lincoln, boasted of foiling assassination plots, and ran Union intelligence operations that blurred the line between patriotism and profit. In the Wild West, their detectives hunted Jesse James, the Reno Gang, and Butch Cassidy, chasing outlaws across prairies and canyons while newspapers turned every raid, every botched ambush, into national spectacle. Were they heroes of civilization or mercenaries with badges? As the frontier closed and the age of iron and smoke took over, the agency followed the money into the factories and rail yards. Pinkerton operatives infiltrated unions, broke strikes, and marched as armed columns for steel and railroad barons. At Homestead in 1892, their men floated up a river on barges, guns in hand, to retake a besieged mill, and left dead workers and dead agents on the banks. In the truest sense, this was no longer just detective work. It was corporate warfare dressed in the language of law and order. Here lies the tragedy at the heart of their story. An organization born from one immigrant's belief in justice and order became, step by step, a hired fist for the powerful, a private army that answered not to voters or courts, but to contracts and cash. Freedom versus control, law versus profit, democracy versus private power. Those were not abstract debates for the Pinkertons. They were the daily reality of who lived, who died, and who got crushed when capital and labor collided. By the time Congress moved to restrict private armies, the myth and the damage were already done. The Pinkerton name had become a curse in labor halls and a legend in dime novels, a shadow presence haunting both the rise of American industry and its moral collapse. This is their complete story, the rise, the crimes, and the slow, uneven fall of the real Pinkertons, told as a Western epic that never truly ended. And it begins long before the first shot at Homestead, with one restless immigrant on the edge of a growing city, staring into a future no one yet understood. This is, in the truest sense, a complete Pinkerton chronicle. From its humble beginnings with one Scottish barrel maker on the outskirts of Chicago, to a global corporate security brand and a pop culture boogeyman chasing outlaws in games and films, this is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of law and outlaw blurring until almost no one could tell the difference. The path through that world will be clear and chronological. It begins with Alan Pinkerton himself, a radical immigrant tinner and cooper, wandering into the woods for timber and stumbling onto a counterfeiter's camp that turned a tradesman into an accidental detective. From that chance, discovery grows a private agency in 1850 Chicago, guarding railroads, riding shotgun on payroll cars, and adopting the all-seeing eye and the motto, "We never sleep," the living embodiment of a new idea that security could be bought, armed, and pointed. From there, the story moves into war. Pinkerton does not just chase train robbers, he becomes Abraham Lincoln's shadow, claiming to uncover an assassination plot in Baltimore and spiriting the president-elect through the night. Soon, he is running Union intelligence, building networks of informants and spies, misreading enemy numbers, and learning that information can save a nation or mislead it into disaster. Was he a patriot or a contractor with good timing? The answer shifts with every campaign. After Appomattox, when the old ways were dying and the frontier seemed wide open, the agency rides west. The narrative follows agents stalking Jesse James and the Reno Gang, tracking the wild bunch across desolate country, kicking in doors in small Missouri towns and Utah hideouts. Some raids are precise. Others are bloody fiascos that kill civilians and turn local admiration towards the outlaws. In these manhunts, the Pinkertons appear as hard-riding lawmen or hired guns, depending on who is paying and who is bleeding. Then the focus turns inward, from open ranges to factory gates. The same detectives who once guarded presidents and trains now march as private armies for Carnegie Steel and Pullman. At Homestead, barges glide up the river under cover of darkness, At Pullman, agents infiltrate union meetings. Shots are fired, workers die, and Pinkerton becomes a curse word in working class neighborhoods. Civilization is advancing, but at whose expense? Throughout, the narrative stays character driven. Alan, his sons Robert and William, ambitious operatives, frightened strikebreakers, and the labor organizers who face them will be treated as a single tragic cast, a story of family, business, and belief twisting together. Heroes in one chapter become villains in the next. A lost soul in a picket line might see the same badge that once guarded Lincoln now aimed at his chest. And the ending is not really an ending. Legal crackdowns strip the agency of its private army, forcing a transformation into quieter corporate work, even as its legend mutates into the remorseless pursuers of gangs like Linde. The old company survives as a brand, while its name lives on as shorthand for mercenary power in a world that pretends such power is gone. Yet the very beginning is smaller, stranger, almost ironic. This story does not open with a gunfight, a train robbery, or a strike. It begins with one man in the woods outside Chicago, looking for good timber, and finding a hidden camp that would change American law enforcement forever. He was not born a detective. He was made into one by exile, by hunger, and by accident. Alan Pinkerton stepped onto American soil as a Scottish immigrant carrying more scars than prospects. In Glasgow, he had been a radical Chartist, part of a movement demanding that working men have a voice in how their world was run. That philosophy of resistance put him under the gaze of the crown. Surveillance, arrests, and the quiet threat of prison turned him from citizen into fugitive, driving him across the Atlantic with a price on his ideals if not on his head. In Illinois, far from the stone streets of Scotland, he became a barrel maker in the truest sense, a craftsman, not a cop. He settled near Chicago in the tiny town of Dundee, hands stained with pitch and sweat, living the plain life of a tradesman. Yet even there, the old ways were dying. Railroads cut across the prairie, timber meant contracts, and a man who understood both labor and politics could see that this new civilization would reward those who watched closely and moved first. The turning point came on a quiet day, with no gun drawn and no badge in sight. Pinkerton rode out to a small island in the Fox River, looking for good wood to feed his growing cooperative business. Instead of clean timber and solitude, he found signs of life that did not belong. Trampled grass, makeshift shelters, the faint scent of smoke and chemicals. He was a former agitator who knew what a hidden camp meant. So he did what would later define him. He watched. For days, the barrel maker became an observer. From the tree line, he studied men coming and going, strange presses, unfamiliar tools. These were not hunters or honest squatters. They were counterfeiters, quietly manufacturing a parallel currency beneath the nose of a rapidly expanding market economy. No chase, no shootout, just a patient, accidental stakeout by a man whose only weapon was attention. When he finally went to local authorities, the raid that followed was almost an afterthought. The criminals were taken, the presses seized, and the story that spread through Kane County was simple. A Scottish cooper had uncovered a criminal ring the sheriff had missed. In a world where the railroads were bleeding money to theft and fraud, that detail mattered. Officials noticed his persistence. Railroad men, already anxious about bandits and saboteurs, noticed his eye for patterns others ignored. From its humble beginnings on that river island, a reputation formed. This was a story of observation, of patience, of a craftsman turning his skill for fitting staves and hoops into a talent for fitting clues together. Pinkerton became the living embodiment of a new kind of lawman for hire, answering not to the state, but to contracts and capital. And as he realized there was real money in watching, tracking, and outthinking outlaws, one question began to take shape. If a man could sell order to the highest bidder, what would happen when that bidder was ready to wage a private war? The answer came in brick and ink. In 1850, on the rough streets of Chicago where the rail lines met the slaughterhouses, Alan Pinkerton turned his talent for tracking into a business. From its humble beginnings in a small office, he gave it a grand name, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a story of ambition that tried to sound as big as the continent itself. Railroads were exploding across the landscape, banks were moving more money than ever before, and the world was changing faster than the law could keep up. Trains were derailed, safes were cracked, payrolls vanished into the night. Into that fear stepped Pinkerton, selling not just muscle but a philosophy. Disciplined surveillance, careful files, coded reports, and men who could ride shotgun on a cash shipment one day and infiltrate a gang the next. To executives watching profits leak away, he promised order in a world that felt on the edge of chaos. To sell that promise, he needed an image. On the agency's letterhead and office window, he placed a single, unblinking eye, floating in white space, framed by the words, "We never sleep." It was simple and unnerving, the living embodiment of vigilance. The logo whispered that somewhere, an unseen gaze was always awake, always watching, always ready to follow a thief from the rail yard to the end of the earth. Was it protection, or the first hint of a private surveillance state being born in the age of steam? From the very beginning, Allen wrapped this enterprise in ideals. He spoke against slavery, aligned himself with abolitionist circles, and later would work with men close to Abraham Lincoln. He liked to imagine his agency as a shield for civilization, defending law and order against outlaws, saboteurs, and conspirators who threatened the fragile web of commerce holding the young nation together. In the truest sense, he saw his detectives as guardians of the common good, standing between honest labor and predatory crime. But the contracts told a harsher truth. Pinkerton's real loyalty was not to some abstract public, but to the railroads that paid retainers and the banks that signed checks. The agency's case files did not open because justice demanded it. They opened because a corporate ledger had bled. That tension between noble rhetoric and paid protection sat at the heart of the agency, a quiet betrayal built into its foundations. Who decided where law and order ended and private interest began when the same hand wrote both the complaint and the paycheck? That contradiction would only grow as the old ways were dying. The same unblinking eye that watched over mail cars and safes would soon stare down picket lines, and the same men hired to hunt train robbers would be redeployed to break strikes. The structure was already there. A private army, trained, loyal, and for hire. All it needed was a new kind of enemy. Allen Pinkerton stood at the center of this private army, a man who embodied its contradictions before the world even had words for what he was building. From its humble beginnings in Chicago in 1850, his agency was a story of high ideals and hard cash, of justice promised and justice purchased. He had been a radical Chartist in Scotland, an abolitionist in America, a man who claimed to hate tyranny in the truest sense. Yet he would spend his life defending property for those who owned the most of it. From the very beginning, Allen saw himself as something more than an outlaw hunter. In his philosophy, government lawmen were too slow, too corrupt, too tangled in politics to protect a rapidly changing world. The world was changing faster than legislatures and juries could keep up. Railroads were stretching across the continent, and capital was moving in ways the old sheriffs could barely understand. If civilization could not rely on the state, then, in his mind, it would have to rely on him. A disciplined private agency, loyal to contract and reputation, could deliver swifter, cleaner justice than any courthouse. He framed that discipline as family. Pinkerton agents were not just employees. They were brothers in a chosen order, the living embodiment of his creed. They were expected to be sober, discreet, and incorruptible, forbidden from drinking on duty, gambling with clients, or taking side money. Their loyalty was to the eye on the agency's seal and to the man whose name it carried. On paper, it was a brotherhood built on honor and secrecy, closer to a monastic order than a police force. In practice, that secrecy would become both shield and weapon. Where local posses trusted the gun and the posse's roar, Allen trusted patience and paper. His agency pioneered detailed case files, coded reports, and centralized records that tracked suspects across states and years. Agents rode trains not just with rifles, but with notebooks, memorizing faces, timetables, and habits. Surveillance, undercover work, informants placed in gangs and rail yards. This was a proto-modern intelligence network decades before the FBI, a story of information becoming more powerful than the fastest draw. Was it justice, or simply a more efficient way to protect those who could afford protection? Yet even as Allen denounced corruption and tyranny in public speeches, his private empire answered to retainers and contracts, not ballots and juries. He refused to work for slave catchers, but took lucrative railroad deals. He defended Lincoln, then later defended the corporations that crushed Lincoln's little people. That tension sat at the heart of his creation, an idealistic reformer who built a force that could be rented. The old ways were dying, and in the vacuum, Allen Pinkerton offered order, disciplined, secretive, and for hire. The moral drift was already there, waiting for the day his agents would be sent not after bandits, but against entire communities that dared to challenge their employers. Order for hire needed loyal hands, and Allen did not look far. From the very beginning, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency was not only a business, it was a dynasty in progress. A story of loyalty and ambition, of family and hired law, of dreams of order that would one day collide with the reality of power without restraint. At the center of that dynasty stood Allen's sons, William and Robert Pinkerton. They grew up in the Chicago office the way other children grew up in churches or schoolhouses, surrounded by coded reports, wanted posters, and men coming home with bullet scars and half-told stories. From its humble beginnings as a small detective bureau guarding railroads, the agency became their classroom. Allen groomed them as heirs, drilling them in surveillance methods, teaching them how to read a man's posture, how to track rumors across a continent, how to treat the agency's one unbreakable creed, "We never sleep," as the living embodiment of their name. But the Pinkerton clan extended beyond blood. Early operatives formed an inner circle that blurred the line between office staff and secret society. Clerks learned to memorize aliases. Telegraph operators became information brokers. And in 1856, a quiet revolution walked through the door in the form of Kate Warren, the first woman detective in American history. In a world where women were expected to vanish into the background, she weaponized that invisibility. She infiltrated social circles, pried open gossip, and later helped spirit Abraham Lincoln through Baltimore during an alleged assassination plot, turning conventional gender roles into a tactical advantage. Around figures like Warren, Allen built a disciplined community. Agents shared boarding houses, watched each other's backs on trains and in frontier towns, and lived under strict internal codes that demanded secrecy, sobriety on duty, and absolute loyalty to the agency above all else. It was family in the truest sense for many of them. Orphans, immigrants, and every lost soul who wanted purpose in a civilization that rarely offered second chances. They were told they were not mere guards or policemen. They were something higher. That belief came straight from Allen's paternal style. He was protective yet demanding, a stern father who preached sacrifice and treated disobedience as betrayal. Pinkerton, men and women, he insisted, were better than ordinary police, sharper, braver, less corrupt, unshackled by politics. He promised them a philosophy of disciplined freedom, the freedom to act where governments hesitated, the duty to strike where courts moved too slowly. Was that justice? Or just a convenient story to tell themselves? Inside this tight-knit clan, loyalty ran deep, but so did insulation from public scrutiny. William and Robert learned to see the agency as their inheritance. Agents saw it as their home, and clients saw it as a private army on call. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and here stood a family of spies answerable mostly to its own code. What would happen when that code met the fury of entire communities standing in their way? Power without oversight is dangerous. Power with a cause is even more so. As the Pinkerton family tightened its grip on this private army of detectives, the country around them lurched toward a different kind of war, and Allen's world expanded from warehouses and counting rooms to rail lines that stitched the continent together. Railroads were the perfect stage. From its humble beginnings, guarding single depots and cash shipments, the agency's contracts grew into sprawling mandates to protect entire lines across multiple states. Thieves cut telegraph wires, saboteurs pulled spikes from tracks, and outlaw gangs learned that one derailed train could mean a fortune. Pinkerton agents followed them across borders, from Illinois cornfields to Ohio yards and Missouri river crossings, building a web of informants in saloons, section camps, and roundhouses. A brakeman with a gambling debt here, a telegraph operator with a grudge there, each became another eye in a story of expanding surveillance. That reach came with new relationships. Railroad presidents, men who treated miles of track as their personal empire, discovered that Allen's detectives could do what local sheriffs would not or could not. They tracked thieves into rival jurisdictions, infiltrated gangs that slipped between counties, and delivered detailed reports written in a clipped, almost military style. Soon, those reports were being quietly passed from boardrooms to backrooms in statehouses, where governors and senators read them and saw something rare: timely, actionable intelligence in a nation where information still moved at the pace of the horse. The world was changing, and so were the stakes. By the late 1850s, every discussion in those rooms curved back toward slavery, secession, and the looming fracture of the Union. Railroads were not neutral. They were arteries of a new industrial civilization, binding free states and slave states together with iron. Rumors of plots to burn depots, seize trains, or cut northern supply lines began to circulate. Politicians whispered of Southern sympathizers on payrolls and gunmen riding the same tracks as troop trains that had not yet been called up. Who could be trusted when even the post might be intercepted? Into that anxiety stepped Allen Pinkerton, a Scottish immigrant who had come to America chasing freedom and found instead a nation tearing itself apart. His philosophy shifted. Protecting a payroll or a safe car no longer felt sufficient when the very idea of a United States seemed in danger. In the truest sense, he began to see his agency as the living embodiment of loyal Union vigilance, watchful, tireless, and, in his mind, above party. Commercial contracts became, in his view, a training ground for national duty. So when the election of 1860 approached, and the name Abraham Lincoln moved from Illinois courtrooms to the center of the national storm, the path was already laid. Railroad executives who backed Lincoln knew Pinkerton, trusted his methods, and understood his reach. They had seen him guard their assets. Now they would ask him to guard something far more fragile, a president-elect traveling by rail through hostile territory. The barrel maker from Scotland was about to become a shadow around the most important man in America, stepping from the world of thieves and saboteurs into a conflict where one missed detail could alter the fate of the Union. The old ways were dying, and the first modern spy chief of the American state was about to walk out of a depot and onto the stage of history. From the very beginning of Lincoln's journey to Washington, fear and rumor rode the rails beside him. The country was breaking apart, the world was changing, and into that chaos stepped Allan Pinkerton, carrying not a gun at first, but a report. Whispers that President-elect Abraham Lincoln would be murdered in Baltimore before he ever took the oath. This was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, but now played on a national stage. Baltimore in early 1861 seethed with secessionist anger. Railroads converged there, and so did talk of plots, knives, and hidden pistols. Pinkerton's railroad clients begged for protection. He responded in the truest sense as a man who believed his own philosophy. That information, not bravado, decided who lived and who died. From its humble beginnings guarding freight cars, his agency suddenly found itself probing the heart of disunion. Pinkerton dispatched agents into Maryland's secessionist circles, taverns, and drawing rooms. Among them moved Kate Warren, the first female detective in American history, slipping through parlors where male operatives would have stood out. She listened as men boasted over brandy, as sympathizers hinted that Lincoln would never leave Baltimore alive. What began as rumor hardened, in Allen's mind, into a map of conspiracy. He compiled coded notes, names, and half-heard plans, convinced that a mob would strike as Lincoln changed trains in the city, exposed on the street, hemmed in by hostile police. Was every detail accurate? No one could say. But Allan Pinkerton, the living embodiment of his own motto, "We never sleep," chose to act as if one misstep meant national catastrophe. The solution he proposed was as theatrical as it was secretive. Lincoln's public itinerary would continue, complete with crowds and ceremonies, but the real man would vanish from it. Under Pinkerton's direction, the president-elect slipped out of Harrisburg early, dressed in a soft cap and shawl, boarding a night train under an assumed name. Telegraph lines were cut to slow any leak. In the darkness, with shutters drawn and agents posted at each end of the car, Lincoln passed through Baltimore unseen, guarded by operatives who had once shadowed freight thieves, not heads of state. When dawn came, Lincoln was in Washington, alive but politically bruised. Many mocked the tale of the tall rail splitter sneaking into the Capitol in disguise. Pinkerton, stung by ridicule and driven by pride, did something that would define his legend. He published his version. In books and lectures, he cast himself as the man who saved the Union before the war even began, his agents the invisible shield around a reluctant hero. Yet from that moment, questions clung to the Baltimore plot. How real was the danger? Historians have argued ever since, sifting sparse evidence, noting that no arrests followed, no weapons were seized, no concrete conspiracy was laid bare. Some see an authentic emergency, others see a private detective amplifying shadows into daggers. Was Allan Pinkerton protecting Lincoln, or was he also protecting a brand? The episode became a template. Real risks, wrapped in dramatic narrative, presented as proof that the agency stood between civilization and chaos. It was a story that sold, a story that cemented Pinkerton as national guardian, but it also hinted at a quieter betrayal. The line between intelligence and theater was already blurring. And as the Civil War erupted, that line would be tested on battlefields, in failed estimates and costly blunders, where spin could not hide the dead. On paper, the Civil War should have been the end of private adventurism and national security. Instead, it became the moment Allan Pinkerton stepped out of the shadows and convinced the Union that its fate depended on a man who never wore the uniform. In the truest sense, this was the birth of a private spy empire under the flag of a desperate republic. From the very beginning of the war, Allan sold more than services. He sold a story of salvation. After his agents claimed to uncover a plot against President-elect Abraham Lincoln in 1861 and smuggled him through Baltimore under cover of darkness, Pinkerton moved from railroad contracts into the halls of power. General George McClellan, the idealistic young commander of the Army of the Potomac, saw in Allen the living embodiment of organized information in a chaotic world, and made him head of what would be called the Union Intelligence Service. Officially, he was an intelligence chief. In practice, he was running a private spy network for the Union Army, paid through government funds but loyal to his own name, his own philosophy, his own agency. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and into that vacuum stepped a Scottish Cooper turned detective, convinced that his eye on the battlefield was worth as much as any regiment. Pinkerton's wartime methods were crude by later standards, but revolutionary for a country that had never fought a modern industrial war. Agents slipped behind Confederate lines as merchants, laborers, and peddlers, memorizing troop positions and listening in taverns. Prisoners were interrogated in makeshift tents, their offhand remarks weighed as heavily as official reports. Coded messages traveled along telegraph wires, relayed through loyal operators who trusted the all-seeing eye more than distant politicians. It was, from its humble beginnings, an attempt to turn scattered rumors into centralized power. Yet this power was flawed, spectacularly so. Pinkerton's most infamous failure came in his estimates of Confederate strength. Again and again, his reports doubled or tripled the true numbers facing McClellan. What happens when a cautious general is fed nightmare figures? He hesitates. He digs in. He delays. McClellan's already timid advance on Richmond slowed to a crawl, and historians later argued that Pinkerton's bloated counts helped prolong the war, giving the Confederacy time and hope it could scarcely afford. And still, there were real successes that made the delusions harder to see. Pinkerton operatives disrupted suspected sabotage rings, guarded key bridges and rail lines, and claimed to foil attempts on Union leaders beyond Lincoln's early journey. They mapped enemy positions, tracked rebel sympathizers in border states, and offered the Union something it had never possessed before: a single, if imperfect, clearinghouse for military intelligence. This was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, but not just on the battlefield. Each success, each whispered rumor turned into action, deepened Allen's conviction that his private agency stood above ordinary command structures. Was it any surprise that, after the war, he would see no contradiction in serving both government and capital? In his mind, the Union had survived because men like him existed. In his mind, the line between national survival and Pinkerton power had vanished. The war ended, but the habits it forged did not. The centralized files, the undercover operatives, the belief that a private network could police a fractured civilization, these would march forward into railroads, mining towns, and strike-torn cities. The battlefield had merely been the rehearsal. The rehearsal ended in 1865, but the stage it prepared was far larger and far crueler. The guns fell silent, yet the United States stepped into a new kind of war, a story of shattered regions, hungry capital, and men armed with habits they did not know how to put down. Across the South, cities lay burned and fields lay empty, plantations broken into parcels of hope and resentment. Freedmen chased the promise of freedom while former masters chased the memory of control, and between them rode vigilantes, night riders, and ex-Confederate guerrillas who refused to surrender in their hearts. The old ways were dying, but nothing stable had replaced them. In the North, railroads stitched the continent together, iron rails racing west toward Omaha, Cheyenne, and beyond. With them came payroll cars, safe boxes, and a moving river of cash. And where money moved, outlaws gathered. Train robberies, express car heists, and organized gangs spread along the new steel arteries of civilization. The Reno gang in Indiana derailed cars and looted safes. Small bands of deserters and drifters turned from uniform to bandana, from charge orders to hold-up notes. When a train pulled into a lonely siding at midnight, it was never clear who had more guns, the guards inside, or the men waiting in the dark. Into this fractured world stepped the Pinkerton men who had spent 4 years hunting spies and saboteurs. They came home with new disciplines etched into their bones. Surveillance that tracked a man from boarding house to barroom, infiltration that placed agents and outlaw crews in labor halls, armed operations drilled to storm a car, a camp, or a safe house with military precision. In the truest sense, the war had professionalized them. It had also hardened them. A suspect on a payroll ledger looked very much like a traitor on a roster. Allen Pinkerton understood the opportunity. From its humble beginnings, guarding a single railroad line, his agency now presented itself as the living embodiment of order in a broken nation. Broadsides and contracts promised a disciplined, battle-tested force ready to shield railroads, banks, and industrialists from the new criminal underworld. Before there was a federal bureau for such work, there was Pinkerton, offering what sounded, to nervous businessmen, like salvation. To hire them was to buy a private army without the bother of politics or elections. The scale changed almost overnight. What had started as regional detective work rooted in Chicago expanded into a continent-spanning web. Field offices appeared in St. Louis, Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco, each one a hub for roving operatives who rode trains, stagecoaches, and riverboats under false names. Case files traveled with them, thick with photographs, aliases, and coded reports. A bandit who robbed a train in Missouri could find his description waiting in a Pinkerton desk in California before he even crossed the mountains. Loyalty to the agency meant belonging to a new kind of family, one bound not by blood, but by reports, retainer fees, and a shared philosophy that private order could replace public weakness. Yet even this expanding net had its blind spots. And beyond the last telegraph pole stretched a different world. West of the settled towns lay territories where sheriffs were few, legends traveled faster than warrants, and the line between lawman and outlaw blurred with every campfire tale. The world was changing, and the next chapter for the Pinkertons would not be written in parliaments or on formal battlefields, but in that lawless, romanticized West, where their name would become both legend and curse, and where every pursuit would test just how far a private army could go before it broke the very civilization it claimed to protect. Out on the far edges of the map, where telegraph wires thinned and county lines meant almost nothing, the next act of this story waited beside the rails. The battlefields and boardrooms of the East faded behind smoke and distance, and in their place rose a new stage for ambition and fear, the American West, stretching around the iron roads that cut straight through it. From its humble beginnings as a handful of tracks near Chicago, the railroad web spread across prairies, mountains, and desert, dragging depots, water towers, and boomtowns in its wake. A siding in Nebraska could become a town in a season, a gambling den and freight office in the same building, a saloon sharing a wall with the telegraph room. Money moved faster than law. Gold shipments, payroll chests, mailbags full of cash and bonds all rode in thin-walled cars that rattled through darkness, guarded by a few nervous men with old shotguns. To an ambitious outlaw, it was the living embodiment of temptation. Railroad barons understood the danger. Their empire depended on keeping trains moving and shareholders calm, and local sheriffs could not ride every mile of track. So the contracts that had once paid the Pinkertons to watch depots in the East expanded into something larger and more permanent. Rail companies hired the agency as a standing shield, granting its operatives authority to ride trains armed, to investigate robberies from one end of a line to the other, and to chase suspects across county and state borders without waiting for a marshal's permission. In the truest sense, the Pinkertons became a roaming jurisdiction of their own. Their methods evolved with the landscape. This was not the crowded world of city alleys and factory gates, but a wide, echoing frontier where a man could vanish into sagebrush or mining camps overnight. To keep up, the agency built thick dossiers on suspected train robbers and gang affiliates, tracking family ties, old prison mates, favorite saloons, and past jobs. Operatives drank quietly in frontier bars, posed as drifters in gambling halls, even signed on as ranch hands or rail workers, all to listen for one loose tongue promising easy money off the next express. When a robbery came, the response was swift and theatrical. Telegraphs snapped down the line, descriptions spread from division office to division office, and suddenly writers were in the saddle. Pinkerton pauses moved with a coordination that made them feel less like detectives and more like mercenaries on retainer. They followed spoor along creek beds, leaned on informants in half-built towns, and raised posses of local volunteers with the promise of reward money. Detective and bounty hunter became almost the same word, separated only by who signed the pay order. The world was changing, and so was the story told about it. Newspapers in Chicago and New York discovered that nothing sold columns faster than a dramatic train robbery in Missouri or a bloody chase through the Rockies. Dime novelists seized on every rumor, polishing rough gunmen into tragic anti-heroes and turning Pinkerton agents into iron-willed bloodhounds, forever on the trail of some masked rider who swore he was only robbing the rich. Was any of it true? Only in fragments. But the myths traveled faster than the trains themselves. In that mythic space, the Pinkerton man became a character as much as a profession, the relentless pursuer, the shadow that never slept, the instrument of civilization sent to drag the frontier toward order. Yet beneath the legend, something darker grew. The first high-profile clashes with Western gangs hinted at what was coming. The Reno Gang, early pioneers of organized train robbery in the late 1860s, drew the agency into manhunts that ended with lynch mobs and bodies hanging from bridges. Jesse James and his brother Frank turned railroad targets into a personal war against corporations, and Pinkerton agents answered with night raids and bombs that did not always hit the right house. Each pursuit raised the stakes. Each failure pushed the agency toward harsher tactics. When later gangs, like Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, began hitting depots and express cars with military precision, the Pinkertons responded in kind, dispatching teams that looked less like investigators and more like a private army. Was this still law, or something beyond it, bought and paid for by men in distant offices? That question would haunt every posse that thundered out of a rail yard, and it would follow the agency into its most infamous Western campaigns, where the line between protecting property and waging private war would all but disappear. For the railroads, that private war became very real on quiet Midwestern nights, when the shriek of a whistle turned into the roar of gunfire. The first great battlefield was not in the Rockies or the deserts, but along the tracks of Indiana, where a family of small-town thieves reinvented themselves as the living embodiment of a new American nightmare. The Reno brothers came from its humble beginnings in Jackson County, Indiana, a place of churches, cornfields, and quiet resentments. After the Civil War, the world was changing faster than their little town could follow. Veterans came home with dead eyes and dangerous skills. Trains carried fortunes through the dark, and the old ways were dying along the line. Out of that tension grew the Reno Gang, one of the first outlaw crews to make train robbery their specialty, hitting rail lines across Indiana and the broader Midwest in the late 1860s. They struck hard and fast, a payroll safe hauled off into the night. A mail car looted while passengers lay face down on the floor. In the truest sense, it was a story of freedom twisted into greed, of men who saw the rails as a rolling bank with no sheriff in sight. But the railroads were not about to let a handful of country bandits embarrass their new empire. So they called in the Pinkertons. To corporate directors, the agency promised order. To the Renos, it brought a different kind of war. Alan Pinkerton's men deployed undercover operatives along the lines, rode the trains as anonymous passengers, and built quiet alliances with local lawmen who were suddenly taking orders from Chicago offices rather than county courthouses. Agents slipped into the gang's circles, posing as drifters and disreputable cousins, nursing cheap whiskey in the same taverns where Reno associates bragged too loudly. They mapped safe houses, watched who came and went from farmsteads, and traced where stolen bonds were fenced. Arrests followed, but not always in clean, courtroom-ready fashion. Warrants blurred into ambushes. Suspects found themselves dragged from beds in midnight raids that looked less like due process and more like sanctioned kidnapping. Was this law, or hired vengeance with paperwork attached? The backlash was brutal. As captured Reno men were moved under guard, masked lynch mobs intercepted them, hauling prisoners from jail cells and train cars to improvised gallows. 3 here, 4 there, hanged in the dark while the law looked the other way. Pinkerton reports condemned the killings, yet the timing, the shared information, the convenient gaps in protection raised a quieter question. How accidental was this cooperation with vigilantes really? By the end, the gang was broken not by a dramatic shootout, but by a grim procession of backwoods hangings that left almost no one to stand trial. The Pinkertons had shown what their Western playbook could do: relentless surveillance, deep infiltration, and a willingness to let the rope finish what the badge began. It was a template, and it would be used again, against outlaws far more famous than the Renos, and in places where the blood would not wash away so easily. The template found its most famous target in the 1870s, when the agency's unblinking eye fixed itself on 2 former guerrillas from Missouri. Jesse and Frank James had ridden with pro-Confederate bushwhackers during the Civil War, ambushing Union patrols and terrorizing Loyalists. When the guns fell silent, they did not come home to peace. They brought the war with them. From its humble beginnings as a pair of hardened brothers raiding banks in Clay County, the James Younger gang became the living embodiment of a wounded South's defiance. Trains were held up, safes blown, and payroll stolen, often from railroads and banks seen as instruments of Northern victory and carpetbagger civilization. In the saloons and farmhouses of Missouri, some whispered that Jesse was avenging burned homes and murdered kin, that he was an outlaw in the truest sense, fighting the same enemy by different means. Those whispers did not impress the men who actually owned the rails and vaults. To the railroad barons and bankers, this was not a romantic story of resistance. It was a direct assault on profit, order, and the philosophy of progress that justified their expanding empires. They had no patience for local sheriffs who had ridden with Jesse's old commanders or owed favors to his cousins, so they turned, once again, to the Pinkertons. The contracts that followed transformed the chase into a high-stakes campaign. Pinkerton operatives mapped the James family's world with cold precision, staking out the farm near Kearney, tracking cousins, in-laws, and anyone who might slip a message under a door. Informants were paid to drink in the same taverns as former guerrillas, to repeat every rumor about a planned raid, to note every horse that vanished in the night. Local sheriffs were drawn in, some eager to cooperate, others dragging their feet, torn between the badge and old loyalties. Who wanted to be the man who arrested a neighbor's son hailed as a hero at Confederate reunions? Newspapers seized on the tension and turned it into spectacle. Each robbery was written up as a daring exploit, each escape as proof that Jesse James was a folk Robin Hood dancing rings around faceless pursuers. The Pinkertons, with their anonymous agents and single unblinking eye, became the perfect foil, relentless, mechanical, almost inhuman. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, played out in column inches and wanted posters. But myths have consequences. Every successful raid burnished Jesse's legend and bruised the agency's pride. The old ways were dying, the world was changing, and the Pinkertons could not afford to look weak before the corporations that fed them. So, in boardrooms and back offices, a decision took shape. If careful surveillance and patient infiltration could not break the James family, something harsher would. One night in rural Missouri, that decision would ignite, and the line between lawman and hired killer would be crossed in fire and blood. The decision arrived at those desks in Chicago and New York became a midnight knock on a farmhouse door. In January 1875, under a winter sky near Kearney, Missouri, a small team of Pinkerton agents moved through the dark toward the James family home, convinced that decisive violence would finally end the saga of Jesse and Frank. It was meant to be a clean strike, a story of law closing in on outlaw legend. From its humble beginnings as a one-man detective office, the agency had promised precision, intelligence, and restraint. Yet the men sent to the James farm did not come with warrants and handcuffs. They came armed, nervous, and guided by a philosophy that saw the house itself as enemy territory. Somewhere along the line, the family home had been recast as a fortress, Zerelda James as a collaborator, and every shadowed window as a rifle barrel waiting to flash. Accounts differ in the details, but the core remains the same. Approaching under cover of night, the agents attempted to flush the brothers out, hurling an incendiary device through a window or into the yard. Whether called a flare, a grenade, or a bomb, it was a weapon meant to terrify and dislodge. Instead, it rolled or landed where no one intended. A moment of silence, then a blast that tore the quiet Missouri night apart. Inside the farmhouse, the explosion ripped through the James family. Jesse and Frank were not there. The raid's primary quarry had slipped the noose yet again. In their place, the blast found a child. Young Archie Samuel, Jesse's half-brother, was killed instantly, his small body torn by the force meant for grown men with guns. Their mother, Zerelda, was mangled, her arm shattered so badly it would be amputated. The Pinkertons had planned an arrest. They delivered a maiming and a child's death. This was the turning point, the very beginning of a new image for the agency. Instead of triumphant headlines about dangerous outlaws brought to heel, newspapers across Missouri and beyond printed words that burned. Murderers, butchers, assassins of women and children. Was this justice or hired terror in the truest sense? The story that spread was not of brave detectives, but of a private army throwing bombs into a sleeping family's home. In a world where the old ways were dying and corporations were ascendant, the Pinkertons became the living embodiment of that shift. Not impartial guardians of civilization, but corporate mercenaries willing to use fire and fear to protect railroad profits and bank balances. Public outrage in Missouri hardened into regional loyalty for Jesse James, recasting him as a persecuted son rather than a simple robber. Each fresh article, each angry sermon, pushed the agency's reputation further from idealistic guardians and closer to hired guns. And in that smoke and ruin, another truth settled over the country. If this was how the Pinkertons hunted one family, what would they do to an entire town or a gathering of workers standing in their way? Railroad men read the same headlines and drew a very different lesson. Where farmers saw a family burned and maimed, executives saw an agency willing to go to war for their property. To them, the James raid was not a scandal, it was a demonstration. From its humble beginnings, guarding rail depots and payroll cars, the Pinkerton name had been built on a simple promise: results. Trains kept moving, safes kept closing, and men who robbed the iron roads tended to end up in coffins or chains. In boardrooms from Chicago to New York, that was all that mattered. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and in this new industrial order, a private army that never slept felt less like a moral question and more like a necessary tool. So contracts stayed in place. In some cases, they grew. Bank directors whispered that Alan Pinkerton was the living embodiment of modern security, a man who understood that civilization rested on ledgers, timetables, and the threat of force behind them. If a few doors were kicked in, if a few suspected associates were roughed up, that was the cost of doing business in a dangerous land. Out along the branch lines and in the small towns those rails cut through, the story sounded very different. Here, the Pinkerton badge did not mean protection. It meant that distant capital had decided a problem needed solving. A farmhouse might be treated as a fortress, a neighbor as an accomplice, a child as collateral. Families who had never seen a stock certificate watched armed strangers ride in for a bank's quarrel, then ride out before the smoke cleared. To many in these rural and working class communities, the agency's philosophy revealed itself in the truest sense: loyalty to the hand that paid, indifference to the hands that tilled, mined, and hauled. The James family became a symbol, but they were hardly alone. Tales spread of doors broken at midnight, of questions asked with fists, of bodies left on dirt floors while telegraphs rattled congratulations hundreds of miles away. Dime novels and newspapers seized on this split and magnified it. Some pamphlets, often subsidized by rail interests, painted Pinkerton operatives as tireless hunters, a story of bravery and discipline beating back the outlaw tide. Others turned them into villains, soulless killers with legal papers and private contracts, hunting men whose only crime in the telling was resisting a rigged system. One week a Pinkerton might be the hero on a lurid cover. The next, the faceless gunman burning a cabin for a banker's peace of mind. Alan Pinkerton bristled at the criticism. In interviews and letters, he framed the James raid as a tragic necessity, an ugly skirmish in an undeclared war against outlaws who hid behind mothers and children. His men, he insisted, acted within their mission. If blood had been spilled, blame lay with those who chose the outlaw life and dragged their families into the line of fire. But beneath the defenses, the divide only widened. In cities and corporate offices, the agency still looked like progress, a disciplined shield for a new economic order. In the countryside, it was becoming something else, a hired gun pointed downward, not outward. And as the West modernized, as railroads cut deeper and factories pulled workers into their orbit, a darker question loomed over the horizon. What would happen when those same methods were turned not on bandits in the brush, but on thousands of organized workers standing shoulder to shoulder, refusing to move? By the late 1890s, that darker question was already taking shape in gun smoke and telegraph wires, and it carried a new name whispered in saloons and rail yards: the Wild Bunch. If Jesse James had been a folktale and the Reno Gang a warning, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were the living embodiment of the last great outlaw dream, laughing in the face of a civilization that was closing in from all sides. Their story was a story of motion and momentum, of horses and steel rails, of easy charm masking hard calculation. From its humble beginnings in small-time rustling, the Wild Bunch graduated to the big stage: banks in booming railroad towns, Union Pacific payroll trains, depots that had sprung up almost overnight wherever the tracks went. The frontier was shrinking, but that only sharpened their ambition. If the world was changing, they would rob the very engines of that change. On the other side of that equation stood the Pinkertons, no longer improvising frontier trackers, but seasoned manhunters with decades of experience. From the very beginning of the Wild Bunch spree, agency files began to thicken. Mugshots, aliases, family histories, rumored hideouts, even reports on how Butch joked with hostages and how Sundance handled a revolver. Pinkerton offices from Denver to San Antonio traded details over the telegraph, turning gossip into data and data into a noose that tightened a little more with every robbery. What followed was a long, uneasy dance between freedom and civilization. The Wild Bunch answered pressure with movement. Hole in the wall in Wyoming, robbers roost in Utah, backcountry ranches in Colorado and New Mexico. They rode fast, split up, regrouped, vanished into badlands where maps were more suggestion than fact. Their easygoing manners and generous tips in town made them folk heroes to some, a traveling family of outlaws that seemed almost idealistic in the truest sense, robbing railroads and banks rather than poor farmers. Yet each friendly handshake risked exposure, because somewhere in the room, a Pinkerton informant might be listening. The agency countered charm with patience. Detectives shadowed girlfriends and cousins, bought drinks for loose-tongued cowhands, and quietly paid telegraph clerks to copy suspicious messages. It became a pattern of parallel triplets. The gang moved, the Pinkertons followed, the circle tightened. Sometimes the irony was almost theatrical. An agent would ride into a town to question witnesses, never knowing Butch had slept in the same hotel room a week before. Eventually, the chase could not be contained by American borders at all. As the Wild Bunch splintered under pressure, Butch and Sundance slipped south, first to New York, then to Argentina and Bolivia, trying to outrun both the law and the century itself. Pinkerton reports followed them across oceans, trading saddles for steamships, tracking bank transfers and foreign newspaper clippings rather than fresh hoofprints in the dust. The hunt had become global, but the romance was fading. The old ways were dying, even for outlaws. In that pursuit lay a metaphor for the agency itself. The Wild Bunch were being pushed off the American stage by railroads, telegraphs, and fenced land, and the Pinkertons were being pushed with them, out of the open country and into the boardrooms. This was their last ride as frontier heroes for hire, the final act in a story that began with stagecoaches and would end with strikebreakers. Once the last outlaw gang was scattered to foreign graves and false names, those same detectives, with their thick files and tireless networks, would turn from canyons and cattle towns towards smokestacks and factory gates. And the question that had hovered at the edge of the West would finally step into the center of the industrial world. What happened when a private army, trained on the frontier, was unleashed on its own working class? The world was changing. The old ways were dying. The frontier of cattle trails and canyon hideouts gave way to a new landscape of brick, smoke, and steel, where the most dangerous robberies no longer happened beside a lonely track, but inside the ledgers of vast corporations. In the Gilded Age, the United States became the living embodiment of industrial ambition. Railroads stitched the continent together. Steel mills turned night into day with molten light, and factories rose over swelling cities, drawing in immigrants and migrants chasing their own fragile dreams of freedom. But behind that glittering facade, the rhythm of progress sounded more like a hammer on bone. 12 or 14-hour shifts, starvation wages, and machines that could maim a worker in a heartbeat. Families crammed into tenements, children labored in mills, and the smoke that crowned the new civilization carried the bitter taste of exhaustion. From its humble beginnings as a nation of small workshops and farms, the industrial world had become a story of scale and control. Owners grew richer than old railroad barons had ever imagined, while the men and women who fed the furnaces discovered that individually they were powerless. So they tried something radical. They organized. Labor unions, at first scattered and fragile, began to knit together workers who shared the same blisters, the same debts, the same anger. Strikes erupted in rail yards and foundries as workers demanded shorter hours, safer conditions, and wages that could actually sustain a family. To the industrialists, this was not a plea for dignity. It was an attack on authority. If a foreman could no longer rule by fear, if profits could be checked by collective demands, what did that say about who truly held power? In their eyes, the organizer standing on a crate outside the factory gates looked less like a neighbor and more like an outlaw with a different kind of gun, the power to stop production. And when those owners searched for someone to confront this new threat, their gaze fell on a familiar name. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, once celebrated for chasing train robbers through the wilderness, now received a different kind of contract. Corporations hired them to spy on workers, to slip agents into union meetings under false names, to map out leaders and sympathizers with the same precision once reserved for bandit gangs. A speech in a rented hall became a suspect rendezvous. A strike fund looked, on paper, like the treasury of a criminal conspiracy. There was a grim irony here. Men who had hunted Jesse James now took notes in crowded saloons, pretending to be comrades while quietly reporting every whispered plan. This was more than a change in assignment, it was an ideological pivot. The agency's old rhetoric of law and order shifted almost imperceptibly until order meant uninterrupted production, and law meant the contracts and property rights of steel kings and railroad presidents. In the truest sense, the definition of crime itself was being rewritten. Collective action, once a constitutional right to assemble and petition, was increasingly framed as sedition. A picket line could be described in reports with the same language once used for a posse of armed raiders. And the consequences would not stay on paper. The same private army that had carried rifles across prairies would soon march beside factory walls, hired not to protect passengers or presidents, but to escort strikebreakers through chanting crowds. Pinkerton guns, polished and ready, would be leveled not at masked riders under a desert moon, but at unarmed men, women, and sometimes children standing before mill gates. What happened when the tools of frontier justice were brought into the heart of the city? The answer would arrive in the form of shattered skulls, bloody rivers, and a public reckoning that the agency could not simply outshoot. That reckoning began at places whose names would stain the Pinkerton legend forever, where the clash between labor and capital turned from a legal dispute into open warfare, and where the line between detective and mercenary finally disappeared in the smoke above the steelworks. Those steelworks and rail yards did not erupt by accident. Behind the gun smoke and broken skulls stood boardrooms, ledgers, and a new kind of corporate war room where the Pinkertons were not a last resort, but a line item. From its humble beginnings, chasing counterfeiters and train robbers, the agency had become the living embodiment of industrial power in motion. By the late 19th century, a manager facing unrest did not ask whether to call the Pinkertons. The question was simple: which service to buy? There were undercover operatives, drilled to pose as ordinary workers, sharing cheap boarding houses and cold lunches while quietly mapping the Union from the inside. There were squads of imported strikebreakers, guarded to and from the mills, ready to cross picket lines and keep the furnaces lit. There were armed guards, rifles in hand and badges on their coats, patrolling factory gates as if defending a frontier fort, and above all, there was information. Detailed intelligence reports on union leaders, their speeches, their habits, their weaknesses, flowed back to corporate clients. Who drank too much? Who had a sick child? Who could be bribed, threatened, or fired to break the line of solidarity? In a world where the old ways were dying and labor was learning to move as one, knowledge became a weapon as sharp as any bayonet. Inside Pinkerton headquarters, this was framed not as oppression, but as order. Agency leadership spoke the language of civilization and property, insisting that strikes were not expressions of freedom, but a form of coercion. A walkout was painted as a hostage situation in slow motion, the factory seized, the machinery idled, the right to work of non-strikers trampled underfoot. If violence followed, they argued, it began the moment the gates were blocked, not when the first shot rang out. In that philosophy, a preemptive show of force became self-defense in the truest sense. Corporate clients embraced that logic eagerly. To them, the Pinkertons were a dream made real, a disciplined, loyal, and above all deniable force. Unlike police chiefs or governors, they did not answer to voters. Unlike the army, they did not need an official declaration or a legal pretext. They answered to the contract, to the retainer, to the man signing the checks. If a governor hesitated and a sheriff refused, a railroad baron could still deploy an entire private battalion under a different name. The scale was staggering. By some contemporary estimates, Pinkerton operatives and affiliated guards outnumbered the entire standing U.S. Army, a private army in all but legal definition, scattered across mines, mills, and rail yards. This was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, played out not in dusty outlaw camps, but in the heart of American industry. Because what happened when that private army turned its sights on American citizens, on men whose only crime was refusing to work? The answer would come soon, in riverfront fortresses, armored barges, and blood-slicked barges drifting under a shocked national gaze. That riverfront battlefield had a name long before the barges appeared: Homestead, Pennsylvania, a mill town on the Monongahela, where Andrew Carnegie's steelworks rose in smoke and flame as the living embodiment of industrial power, and of what that power cost. By the early 1890s, the Homestead plant was one of the most advanced steel mills in the world, turning ore and sweat into the beams and rails that held up modern civilization. From its humble beginnings as a modest works, Carnegie Steel had become a kingdom of fire. The company's philosophy promised progress and efficiency, but the men who fed the furnaces worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, in heat that warped tools and broke bodies. Their wages had been cut again and again, even as Carnegie preached an idealistic gospel of wealth, insisting that great fortunes would someday uplift the poor. For the men of Homestead, that sermon rang hollow over the clang of steel. Standing between those workers and complete corporate control was the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. The Amalgamated was one of the strongest craft unions in the country, in the truest sense, a story of skilled men demanding not only better pay, but dignity, influence, and the right to organize their own world inside the mill gates. To Carnegie and his executives, that meant a challenge to management's authority, a threat to profits, and an obstacle that had to be removed. At the center of the coming storm stood Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's hard-edged lieutenant, a man whose loyalty was to production schedules and profit margins, not to any dream of shared freedom. While Carnegie sailed to Scotland, carefully distant from the coming clash, Frick drew a line. The union contract would not be renewed. Wages would be cut. When the Amalgamated refused, Frick locked them out and turned the mill into a fortress, ordering high fences, barbed wire, and sniper towers as if preparing for a military siege. This was no metaphor. Frick quietly arranged for hundreds of replacement workers to be housed nearby, and just as quietly, he reached for a private army. He signed a secret contract with the Pinkerton Detective Agency, the same outfit that had chased outlaws and guarded railroads, now hired to crush a union. The plan was clinical and cold. Bring in several hundred armed Pinkerton agents by river, under cover of darkness, land them at the mill, and retake Homestead by force. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying. This was not a sheriff's posse riding out after bandits, but a corporate war, with steel magnates on one side and organized workers on the other, each seeing the other as an outlaw to be subdued. On the night the barges pushed upriver, packed with rifles and hired men, they drifted toward thousands of angry, desperate steelworkers massed on the shore, a collision course written in blood, with no one in power willing to turn them back. What happens when a private army meets a town that refuses to kneel? Gunfire answered the question. Just after 4 a.m. on July 6, 1892, two black barges crept up the Monongahela River, lashed to a tug, swallowed in fog. Inside, nearly 300 armed Pinkerton men waited in the dark, rifles stacked, cartridges packed, hired by Carnegie Steel to retake Homestead, a private army gliding past sleeping houses, the living embodiment of corporate will, pretending it was simply keeping order. But the town was not asleep. Word had spread the night before, passed from millgate to boarding house to crowded tavern. From its humble beginnings as a steel town, Homestead had become a fortress of labor, and by dawn, thousands of workers and townspeople lined the riverbanks. Some held hunting rifles and shotguns, others gripped pistols, iron bars, even bricks torn from foundations. Boys carried pails of stones. Old men leaned on canes and muttered that the old ways were dying, that this was the New World's war. The tug nosed in toward the company landing. A worker stepped forward with a megaphone, calling out through the mist, warning the barges not to land, telling the Pinkertons to go back. The answer was a shot. No one would ever agree who fired first, but the crack of a single rifle tore through the fog, followed by a volley from both shore and barge. In an instant, the quiet riverfront became a battlefield. Bullets ripped through the gray light, slamming into pilings, splintering fences, punching through the thin walls of the barges. Pinkerton riflemen fired from portholes cut in the wood, trained marksmen shooting at silhouettes on the bank. The workers dug in behind coal piles and rail ties, returning fire, dragging the wounded back by their belts. Freedom and civilization were meeting muzzle to muzzle, and neither side meant to blink. Twice, the Pinkertons tried to land, lowering gangplanks toward the shore under covering fire. Twice, they were driven back by a hail of bullets in a storm of rocks, scrap iron, and curses. At one point, strikers rolled a burning railcar down the tracks toward the river, hoping to set the barges ablaze, a story of desperation, improvisation, and raw fury in the truest sense. The car derailed short of the water, an almost grimly comic failure in the middle of carnage, but the message was clear. Homestead would not open its gates. For hours, the shooting continued. Men fell screaming on the riverbank. Men slumped silently inside the barges. By mid-morning, bodies lay on both sides, at least 7 dead, scores wounded, some dying slowly in the heat. The fog burned off, and with it went any illusion that this was a simple labor dispute. This was war. Trapped, low on ammunition, and terrified, the Pinkertons finally raised white flags, bed sheets, handkerchiefs, whatever they could find. Negotiators rode out under uneasy ceasefire. The agents agreed to surrender their weapons and submit to arrest, believing they were choosing life over certain death. What they walked into instead was an enraged town. As the disarmed Pinkertons filed off the barges, a gauntlet formed. Men spat in their faces, women swung umbrellas and hurled stones, boys darted into land punches and vanished. Some agents were beaten bloody, stripped, humiliated, marched through Homestead under the eyes of the very families whose fathers and brothers they had been hired to break. The workers had won the field, but the victory felt jagged. They had defended their homes, yet the sight of broken bodies on both sides lingered. In the crowd, triumph sat uneasily beside shock, a realization that a line had been crossed, that the world was changing and nothing about this fight could be easily undone. Newspapers carried the images and casualty lists across the nation, turning Homestead into a symbol, a warning, and a question. If private war could erupt on a Pennsylvania riverbank in broad daylight, what would the next battle between capital and labor look like? Homestead did not stay on the Monongahela. Within days, it was on every breakfast table in America. What had begun as a local labor dispute now unfolded as a story of invasion, of hired guns landing under cover of darkness, of an industrial titan calling in a private army to reclaim his fortress of steel. Newspapers seized on the imagery. In Pittsburgh and across the industrial belt, editors described the Pinkertons as armed intruders and mercenaries. Men who crossed a river in armored barges to fire on American workers, defending what they saw as their only shield against starvation. Political cartoons turned the agency's all-seeing eye into a symbol of corporate tyranny, looming over gaunt laborers, while Carnegie's mills belched smoke in the background. From its humble beginnings guarding railroads, the firm that once sold itself as the living embodiment of law and order was being recast as the muscle of capital, an outlaw force in the truest sense. The shock reached Washington. Senators who had praised industrial progress suddenly spoke of private war on the Senate floor. In the House, fiery speeches denounced the existence of any standing force, owned by corporations, that could rival state militias in numbers and firepower. If the United States Army was limited by law and constitution, what did it mean that one detective agency had, at times, more armed men under contract than the federal government itself? Committees called for investigations, hearings probed Pinkerton contracts with railroads and steel trusts, and new bills proposed to draw a hard line between public authority and hired guns. Labor leaders did not hesitate. For them, Homestead was proof, not anomaly. They pointed to earlier strikebreaks on the railroads, to Pinkerton infiltrators inside unions, to agents who rode into mining towns and stockyards whenever workers dared to organize. The message was simple and devastating. Capital would use any means, even a private military, to crush dissent. Pinkerton became shorthand for strikebreaker, a dirty word that carried a whole philosophy of betrayal, where dreams of freedom and fair wages met rifle fire and barbed wire perimeters. Inside the agency, the response was swift and defensive. Official statements framed Homestead as a tragic necessity, insisting that Pinkerton men had gone in merely to protect property and restore civilization against an unruly mob. Executives emphasized contracts, legality, the sacred duty of guarding investments in a dangerous world. Violence, they argued, had begun with the workers, whose lawless resistance forced agents to defend themselves. It was a familiar inversion, the men on the barges as victims, the men on the riverbank as aggressors. Yet, even as headlines blackened the Pinkerton name, the telegraph wires did not fall silent. Some employers, watching Homestead from afar, drew a darker lesson. Here was an outfit that would sail into a war zone, take casualties, and keep its mouth shut afterward. If the old ways were dying, if public opinion turned against brute force, there were still those willing to pay for it in the shadows. And as the backlash mounted, another confrontation loomed that would test just how far the nation was willing to let this private army go. The confrontation that loomed arrived in 1894, not at a steel mill's gate, but in a model town that was supposed to be the living embodiment of industrial harmony. Pullman, Illinois, from its humble beginnings, was sold as a utopia. Neat brick houses, manicured streets, and a company that claimed to care for its workers like family. Then the Depression hit, wages were slashed, and the rent in that tidy company town stayed exactly the same. What began as frustration over pay and housing became a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom promised and freedom denied. Pullman Palace Car Company workers walked out, led by men who believed the old ways were dying and that collective action was their only weapon. When the American Railway Union, under Eugene Debs, called for a nationwide boycott of trains hauling Pullman cars, the conflict leapt from one town to an entire rail network. Trains stopped, mail stalled. The world was changing, and the railroads did not intend to let a group of car builders dictate the pace. So the magnates reached for a familiar answer. Again, railroads and industrialists turned to private detectives and armed guards, hiring Pinkertons and kindred agencies to ride the rails, guard depots, and keep the trains moving at any cost. Federal troops would come later. At the very beginning, it was the private armies that fanned out along the tracks, a shadow force answering not to voters or courts, but to corporate boards. In city after city, the pattern repeated with a grim, mechanical rhythm. Agents infiltrated union meetings under false names, passing along membership lists to employers. Some posed as the most radical voices in the room, urging sabotage or violence that could justify a crackdown. Others rode shotgun on trains, carbines in hand, escorting strikebreakers past jeering crowds who saw those detectives as hired outlaws in the truest sense. Clashes followed. In Chicago, rail yards became battlefields, with guards and deputies firing into crowds that hurled stones and torched rail cars. In smaller towns, workers woke to find anonymous threats slipped under doors or found themselves followed home by men who never gave their names. A few agents were beaten, some killed. Far more workers ended up bloodied, jailed, or blacklisted, their families pushed to the edge of starvation. The message was simple and brutal: challenge the railroads, and an invisible army would appear. Each incident deepened the agency's reputation as the muscle of big business. Homestead was no aberration, it was a template. Whether in the coal fields of Pennsylvania, the yards of Chicago, or the smelters of the West, the same faces appeared in different hats, moving from strike to strike, from one battlefield of civilization to the next. For ordinary Americans watching the newspapers fill with tales of armored trains and private gunmen, a realization took hold. If corporations could field their own armies, if those armies could fire on citizens with near impunity, then where did the state end and private power begin? That question would haunt the next phase of the Pinkerton story, as lawmakers, unionists, and even rival capitalists began to wonder whether this private force had finally gone too far. The backlash did not stay in the streets or the newspaper columns. It marched straight into the halls of power. What began as outrage over dead steelworkers and bloodied rail yards hardened into something rare in American history, the state openly admitting that a private corporation had become too dangerous to ignore. From its humble beginnings as a one-man detective office, the Pinkerton Agency had grown into the living embodiment of a private army hired by railroads, mine owners, and steel barons to do what local sheriffs could not or would not do. By the early 1890s, Pinkerton operatives had been used against striking workers so often that Pinkerton became shorthand for corporate terror. Legislators heard the same stories again and again: secret trains full of armed guards, midnight deployments, gunfire in the dark. If this was civilization, whose civilization was it? The turning point at the federal level came in 1893, in the shadow of Homestead and amid fresh memories of the Pullman strike. Congress passed what became known as the Anti-Pinkerton Act, a deceptively simple law with a loaded message. It barred the United States government from hiring any employee of the Pinkerton Detective Agency or similar agency as part of its armed forces. In the truest sense, it was a story of loyalty and betrayal. The same republic that had once trusted Alan Pinkerton to guard Abraham Lincoln now wrote his company's name into law as a warning. The intent ran deeper than a single firm. Lawmakers feared a future in which presidents and cabinet secretaries could sidestep constitutional limits by renting an army with a pen stroke. The old ways were dying, but even in an age of trusts and monopolies, there were lines they refused to cross. If the government could outsource its monopoly on violence to a contractor with its own clients, its own philosophy, and its own dreams of profit, then what separated a democracy from a corporation with flags and uniforms? States moved as well, especially in industrial battlegrounds. Pennsylvania, Colorado, Ohio, and others drafted their own Pinkerton laws, using the agency's name as a kind of legal curse. Some statutes banned importing armed guards from out of state during labor disputes. Others capped how many private gunmen a company could deploy, or required public registration and strict conditions before any armed force could be assembled. The message was clear: no more secret battalions smuggled in under cover of night, no more private sieges in the company's name. These laws revealed a profound anxiety. For one of the only times in American corporate history, legislators did not merely regulate an industry, they singled out a brand. They treated the Pinkertons not as neutral professionals, but as outlaws in tailored suits, a threat to public order rather than its guardian. It was an admission that the world was changing so fast that even the guardians had to be guarded. And there was a final irony. The agency that had once stepped into a vacuum of law, chasing train robbers and guarding presidents, now found itself constrained as if it were the bandit. The private army that claimed to defend civilization was being told, in statute and in spirit, that it had become a danger to the very order it helped create. The next phase of the Pinkerton story would unfold under those new chains. Those new chains did not just bind the agency, they wrapped themselves around the men behind the badge. The next chapter in the Pinkerton story is not only a tale of corporations and courts, but of individuals trying to live, to earn, to believe, inside a machine that was bigger than any one conscience. From its humble beginnings, recruitment had its own philosophy. The agency did not advertise for gunslingers, it hunted for ghosts. Railroad superintendents, factory bosses, local sheriffs were told what to send. Men who did not drink on duty, who could keep their mouths shut, who could pass unnoticed in a crowd of brakemen or mill hands. Discretion, loyalty, sobriety, the ability to blend into any corner of the industrial world, these were the real weapons. Training was quiet but relentless. Drilling observation, report writing, the memorization of faces and schedules, and above all, the habit of never truly being off the clock. For many operatives, the assignment began with a simple lie and ended with an entire second life. A man hired to guard a steel company might not wear a badge at all. He might put on a canvas shirt, pick up a lunch pail, and clock in beside the very workers he had been sent to watch. Days were spent hauling rails, stoking furnaces, sharing tobacco and stories. Nights were spent in rented rooms, turning those stories into cold, typed reports. Some joined lodges and benefit societies. Others went further, slipping into union meetings, raising their hands in votes, even serving on committees they had been ordered to destroy. The pattern could turn darker. In certain strikes, agents were instructed not only to observe but to agitate, to push tempers higher, to encourage the boldest men to say the wildest words. A whispered suggestion here, a reckless dare there, and suddenly a peaceful crowd became a pretext for calling in armed guards. It was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of men who sang solidarity songs by day and then betrayed the lyrics by night. Was the provocateur a villain, or just an employee following orders in the truest sense? The cost of that double existence was measured in more than wages. Isolation became the constant companion. An operative could never fully relax around the men he worked beside, never bring them home as friends, never admit why a certain notebook was kept so carefully hidden. Every joke shared in the yard, every confidence offered over cheap beer, carried the quiet fear of exposure. The old ways were dying in American industry, but inside the Pinkerton ranks, another death was underway. The slow erosion of an ordinary sense of self. Some clung to a belief in law and order as a kind of armor. A veteran who had guarded Abraham Lincoln's trains or chased a Reno gang robber could tell himself that breaking a strike was simply another front in the same war for civilization. In his mind, radicals and outlaws blurred together, and the badge, visible or invisible, was the living embodiment of stability. Others came for different reasons. Good pay in hard times, the promise of travel and adventure, a chance to hold power over men who had once ignored or mocked them on the factory floor. There were those who discovered they enjoyed that power. A foreman-turned-operative who could fire a suspected organizer with a nod, a detective who could decide which rumor became an official accusation, a man who could summon armed reinforcements with a telegram. Each tasted a small, intoxicating authority. Yet even they were not entirely free. Behind them stood managers. Behind the managers stood corporate lawyers. And behind the lawyers stood industrial barons who would never set foot in a picket line. The operatives were both feared and expendable, both the sharp edge and the disposable handle. In that tension lay the question of culpability. How much blame belonged to the man who swung the club or fired the shot, and how much to those who paid his wages and wrote his orders? Were Pinkerton operatives independent moral agents, or cogs turned by contracts and boardroom decisions far beyond their sight? The world was changing, and the line between personal guilt and systemic violence grew harder to trace. Pattern interrupt. Picture two men on a midnight train car, each pretending to be something he was not. One, a union courier carrying secret minutes in his coat. The other, a Pinkerton agent pretending to be his comrade, sworn to deliver those same papers to the company office. Two outlaws in each other's eyes, each convinced he served justice. Only one would step off the train with his story intact. In the end, life as a Pinkerton operative became a quiet tragedy played out in rented rooms, rail yards, and factory gates. Men entered the agency chasing freedom from poverty or chaos and found themselves enforcing a different, harsher order. Some retired comfortably, convinced they had done necessary work. Others drank alone, haunted by faces from picket lines and by the sense that they had betrayed a kind of family they had helped create. The next phase of the agency's history would test that fragile moral balance even further, as the great confrontations between capital and labor reached their bloodiest peaks. For the Pinkertons, conscience was personal, but control was institutional. While individual operatives wrestled with guilt, the agency itself was quietly building something far colder than any one man's regret. An intelligence machine that turned whole communities into case files. It was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams of freedom mapped out in ink and stored in locked cabinets. From its humble beginnings guarding railroads, the agency learned that information was more profitable than firepower. In Chicago and other regional hubs, clerks assembled dossiers on almost anyone who might threaten an employer's peace of mind. Union leaders, strike agitators, suspected outlaws, even bartenders who heard too much. Each file might hold handwriting samples, physical descriptions, known associates, favored saloons, family ties, and rumors picked up in boarding houses and rail depots. In the truest sense, a man's life could be reduced to a stack of paper he would never see. What made this system terrifying was not just its detail, but its reach. The world was changing, and the Pinkertons embraced every new wire and rail. Telegraph lines carried coded reports from mine camps in Colorado to offices in Chicago in hours, not weeks. Railroads that once needed guards now carried the guards' intelligence, shuttling operatives and paperwork between branch offices scattered across the continent. While a county sheriff chased rumors on horseback, Pinkerton managers compared notes from 3 states and issued orders by nightfall. Who could an isolated local lawman hope to match in that kind of game? Employers quickly understood the power of those files. Steel magnates, railroad presidents, and mine owners requested regular Pinkerton reports naming troublemakers on the shop floor. A single unfavorable note could mean a worker's name passed from one company office to another, an unofficial blacklist that followed him from town to town. Before a strike even began, managers might already know which men to fire, which to bribe, and which to watch at the saloon. The philosophy of open markets and free labor quietly depended on a closed, secret ledger of human reputations. On the ground, the effect was chilling. Workers whispered that anyone might be an informant. The friendly new hire, the boarder at the next bunk, the neighbor who always seemed to ask one question too many. Men lowered their voices not just in front of the foreman, but in their own kitchens. Women wondered whether a husband's name had been written down in some distant office, his fate shaped by strangers. How do ideals of family and loyalty survive when a wrong word at a union meeting can exile a man from an entire industry? In this shadowed world, the Pinkerton archive became the living embodiment of a new kind of power. The old ways were dying, replaced by a civilization where paper trails mattered more than personal honor, and private detectives knew more about citizens than their elected sheriffs. It was a prototype for the surveillance state to come, a rough draft of what government bureaus and federal agents would later refine on a national scale. And as those files thickened, as telegraph keys clacked through the night, a darker question emerged. What would happen when this machinery of secrecy finally met a movement willing to fight back in the open? That movement arrived not with bandits on horseback, but with men carrying union cards. And when it did, the question stopped being abstract. It became a story of contracts, paydays, and whose blood was acceptable collateral. By the early 1880s, Alan Pinkerton was fading. The founder, who had once ridden rails for the Illinois Central, guarded Abraham Lincoln, and preached his own rough philosophy of justice, was a sick man, weakened by strokes and age. In 1884, after allegedly slipping on a Chicago sidewalk and biting his tongue so badly it became infected, Alan died. The man who had been, in the truest sense, the living embodiment of the agency's will was gone. In his place stood his sons, William and Robert. From the very beginning, Alan had wrapped the business in a moral cloak. He hated slavery, distrusted aristocracy, and talked about protecting the people from outlaws and corruption, even as he built railroads and industrialists. It was always a binary contrast: freedom against chaos, civilization against outlaw violence. His sons inherited the files, the offices, and the motto, "We never sleep." What they did not inherit was that same personal crusade. William and Robert were businessmen in a world that rewarded businessmen. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the second generation understood that the real money no longer sat on stagecoaches or in rural banks. It sat in steel mills, rail yards, and company towns. So the agency shifted its weight. Less romance about chasing Jesse James, more contracts for guarding strikebreakers, infiltrating unions, and escorting replacement workers through angry picket lines. Under Allen, labor work had been framed as protecting property from mobs. Under his heirs, it became a core product line. Pinkerton operatives slipped into union halls under false names, reported on organizers, and broke strikes not just with batons, but with information. The agency that once bragged about foiling plots against a president now sold detailed dossiers on coal miners and steelworkers. Was this still law and order, or something colder? Inside the organization, not everyone was comfortable with the answer. Older operatives who had chased train robbers and Confederate spies muttered that they had not signed on to shoot at American workers. Some managers worried that every bloody clash on a picket line stained the brand, turning Pinkerton from a badge of honor into a hissed insult. Reports circulated of agents being recognized in saloons and spat at, called mercenaries, called traitors to their own class. Yet the money flowed. Corporate clients paid on time, paid well, and asked no troublesome questions about collateral damage. Loyalty followed the ledger. What had begun from its humble beginnings as a detective bureau with a conscience was drifting towards something else. A private army for hire, its ideals stripped down to billable hours. Without Allen's charisma to tell a grand story about justice and order, the agency's true shape was harder to hide. It became what it had always risked becoming: a tool for whoever could afford it. And soon, in the furnaces of a Pennsylvania steel town, that tool would be used in a way the whole world could see. The furnaces at Homestead did more than melt steel. They melted the Pinkerton legend. When barges packed with armed agents floated up the Monongahela in 1892, They were not the quiet shadows Allen once imagined, but the living embodiment of a private war hired to break Andrew Carnegie's striking steelworkers at rifle point. The battle that followed was chaos. Gunfire at dawn, men tumbling off barges, workers and townspeople trading shots with detectives who had once claimed to protect order. By the end, bodies lay on the riverbank, and those captured Pinkertons were marched through jeering crowds, beaten and spat on. In the truest sense, this was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams of dignity colliding with the hard edge of corporate power, and the whole world was watching. Newspapers seized on the images. Political cartoonists turned the agency into a monstrous caricature. Pinkerton men drawn as hulking brutes with clubs and rifles, towering over tiny, gaunt workers, clutching empty dinner pails. In some drawings, a giant detective in a bowler hat straddled a factory gate, while Uncle Sam looked on in horror. The message was simple and brutal. Who ruled this new civilization, elected government, or hired guns? From its humble beginnings guarding railroads, the agency had claimed a noble philosophy of law and order. Now, in speech after speech, labor leaders named Pinkerton as the enemy of that very ideal. At union halls, organizers thundered that no democracy could survive while private armies roamed the streets. Progressive politicians echoed them on the campaign trail, holding up Homestead and the Pullman strike as proof that the republic itself was under siege from men who answered only to a paycheck. Then came the pattern no corporation wanted to see. Boycotts, leaflets, pickets not just at factory gates, but at the offices of railroads and steel companies that dared to hire Pinkertons again. Firms that brought in the agency found themselves denounced in sermons, shamed in editorials, and targeted by consumers who refused their goods. The Pinkerton badge still promised results, but it also promised headlines, protests, and lost profits. Asset and liability became two sides of the same tarnished coin. Language followed culture. Pinkerton slipped into everyday speech as an insult, shorthand for a snitch, a strikebreaker, a corporate enforcer who would sell out neighbors for a day's pay. In dime novels and stage melodramas, the noble detective became the sneering heavy, the man who kicked in doors for the rich. Allen's idealistic dream of a national guardian curdled into a punchline and a warning. And as the jokes and jeers spread, lawmakers listened. States began to outlaw the importation of armed guards in labor disputes, to cap the size of private forces, to define, at last, where public authority ended and private muscle had to stop. The old ways were dying. A country that had once tolerated roaming posses and hired armies was deciding that monopoly on force belonged, however imperfectly, to the state. The Pinkertons would not disappear, but their world was shrinking, and another reckoning was on the horizon. The walls closed in slowly, not with one dramatic raid or a single courtroom defeat, but with a steady tightening of laws, headlines, and outrage that turned the Pinkerton name from a badge of authority into a warning. The world was changing, and a company that had once been the living embodiment of private firepower now found that every rifle it deployed risked another scandal, another investigation, another blow to its already poisoned reputation. State legislatures began to move first, passing anti-Pinkerton statutes, banning the importation of armed guards during strikes, and limiting how many detectives a railroad or steel mill could hire. Congress followed with measures that barred the federal government from using the agency at all. Each new rule did not kill the old ways outright, but it made the cost of open confrontation higher, the margin for error smaller. A story of unrestrained corporate warfare was giving way, reluctantly, to a world in which private armies had to retreat into the shadows or disappear. So the Pinkertons adapted. Gunfights on riverfronts and mill yards gave way to guard desks and watch clocks. The same firm that had once sent dozens of armed men to Homestead began selling quieter services, guarding warehouses and railroad depots, escorting payroll trains, standing in lobbies and counting who came and went. The work looked mundane on the surface, almost dull, but beneath it lay the same essential bargain as before: security and intelligence for those who could afford it. Only now, the rifles were holstered, and the violence was meant to stay out of sight. This pivot was gradual rather than dramatic. One year, a railroad hired a full strike-breaking contingent. The next, it signed a contract for property protection and risk assessment. Corporations still wanted leverage against labor, but overt battles with hundreds of imported gunmen had become too dangerous in the court of public opinion. So Pinkerton operatives shifted into undercover roles, infiltrating unions, gathering names, reporting on meetings. The uniforms disappeared, the reports multiplied. Was this reform, or simply a change of costume? From its humble beginnings as a tiny detective bureau, the agency now tried to present itself as a modern, rational part of civilization. Brochures emphasized professionalism, discretion, and nationwide reach. The famous unblinking eye and the motto, "We never sleep," remained, still trading on the mystique of Jesse James chases and Civil War espionage, but the marketing downplayed the corpses on strike lines. In the truest sense, the company was rewriting its own story while still cashing in on the legend. Inside, the structure changed to match the new facade. Regional offices were consolidated into divisions. Specialized units handled everything from insurance fraud to railroad theft, and new international branches appeared in Canada, Mexico, and Europe through partnerships and licenses. Diversification became a survival strategy. If one line of work drew too much scrutiny, another could take its place. The agency was no longer a single, easily targeted private army. It was a web of contracts, subsidiaries, and quiet arrangements stretching across borders. Yet beneath the new titles and polished language, the philosophy remained. The Pinkertons still answered first to paying clients, still sold information and protection to the powerful, still moved in the gray space between law and profit. The era of open gun battles with workers was fading, but the core idea endured, waiting to be reborn in new forms. And as the agency settled behind guard desks and office doors, a deeper question lingered in the background. Had the danger truly passed, or had it simply learned to wear a better suit? The danger had learned to wear a better suit, and by the early 20th century, it also had a government badge. The story of the Pinkertons was never just about one agency. It was a story of a country deciding who would hold the gun, the file, and the right to watch. From its humble beginnings as a one-man shop guarding railroads, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency had been the living embodiment of a private solution to public fears. But the world was changing. The very beginning of the end arrived in 1908, when the Department of Justice quietly assembled a small team of special agents to handle interstate crime and political threats. This Bureau of Investigation, which would later become the FBI, stepped into the same shadows the Pinkertons once claimed as their own. At first, the contrast seemed simple: paid detectives on one side, federal men on the other. In practice, the lines blurred. The Bureau's early leaders studied what had worked for Alan Pinkerton and what had terrified the public. They borrowed methods and discarded the mercenary image. Where the agency had sold its loyalty to whoever could afford it, the new federal force promised loyalty, in the truest sense, to the state. Centralization became the new magic word. For decades, Pinkerton operatives had carried mental maps of criminals and labor organizers, kept private dossiers in locked cabinets, and moved freely from Illinois to Montana to Texas. Now the government began building something bigger: national fingerprint files, standardized criminal records, interstate communications networks. The same philosophy of a single roaming intelligence network was being rebuilt with tax money and legal authority. What need was there for a private national police once the state claimed that role for itself? The irony cut deep. Undercover work, assumed identities, long-term infiltration of gangs and unions, centralized case files and mugbooks, these had once been the exotic tools of Pinkerton men slipping off trains in the dead of night. By the 1930s, they were standard practice for public law enforcement. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, with its vast index systems and cult of secrecy, felt less like a rival invention and more like a nationalized Pinkerton dream. Was this progress, or just a change of uniform? As federal agencies expanded and state police forces matured, the agency did not vanish. It faded. The old ways were dying, not in a blaze of gunfire, but in a slow administrative eclipse. Pinkerton guards still rode trains, guarded payrolls, investigated theft and fraud for corporations, and later watched over warehouses, malls, and mines. The work grew more routine, less cinematic. No more headlines about private armies. No more boasting that their men outnumbered the U.S. Army. By mid-century, the agency was one name among many in a crowded security market, its mythic aura diluted into a corporate logo stamped on guard jackets and ID badges. The outlaw hunters had become risk managers. The feared strikebreakers now competed with firms selling background checks and alarm systems. It was a quiet collapse, a story of power not destroyed but absorbed, as the state reclaimed the monopoly on legitimate force and left the old detective empire drifting between nostalgia and necessity. Yet even in decline, a question lingered in the background. If the methods survived inside the state, had the Pinkertons truly disappeared, or had their shadow simply moved behind a different seal? The shadow did not vanish. It changed uniforms. In the new century, the Pinkerton name stepped off the front page and into the fine print of contracts and corporate ledgers. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying, But the brand that once haunted outlaws and strikers refused to disappear. Instead of collapsing outright, the agency did something far more mundane and far more revealing. It merged, it restructured, it sold itself. From its humble beginnings as Alan Pinkerton's family firm, the company was gradually folded into larger security conglomerates, passed between holding companies and investors who valued the logo and the files more than the legend. By the late 20th century, Pinkerton's was no longer a private army in the truest sense, but a division on an organizational chart, sitting alongside guard services, alarm installers, and insurance investigators. The famous unblinking eye survived on letterhead and ID badges, the living embodiment of a story that had outgrown the people who actually worked under it. Their day-to-day work changed as well. Instead of storming steel mills with rifles, agents traced missing inventory, audited expense reports, and built quiet cases against employees suspected of embezzlement or insurance fraud. A modern Pinkerton might spend more time in a cubicle than on a train, compiling surveillance logs for a retailer plagued by internal theft, or interviewing witnesses for an underwriter suspicious of a suspiciously timed warehouse fire. It was still a story of control and of whose version of events would stand in court, but now the battlefield was a conference room. Yet the old patterns never vanished entirely. Even as the agency rebranded itself as a sober provider of risk management and corporate intelligence, scattered controversies kept surfacing, echoes of the 19th century wars between capital and labor. Reports accused Pinkerton operatives of monitoring union organizers during tense contract fights, or of tracking environmental and anti-globalization activists for multinational clients. How different was a file on a labor leader in 1912 from a digital dossier on a protest organizer in 1999? The tools evolved. The philosophy of who needed watching often did not. There was irony in this transformation. On screen and in novels, Pinkertons remained gun-toting pursuers of train robbers and doomed outlaws, forever chasing the last gang through a mythical West. In popular memory, they were still strikebreakers on barges, or relentless detectives hunting a lost soul across the prairie. In reality, many late-century employees were closer to office workers and mall guards than to frontier lawmen. The disconnect between image and reality only deepened as Hollywood, television, and games recycled the name as shorthand for ruthless authority. By the time the agency's direct power had truly waned, its symbolic power had never been stronger. The Pinkertons became a warning and a metaphor, a story of what happens when private money buys public force. And in the next phase of their afterlife, that symbol would escape the boardroom entirely and ride into the realm of pure myth. That escape into myth began almost as soon as the agency did. From the very beginning, the Pinkertons were not just detectives or hired guns. They were characters, ready-made for a growing mass audience hungry for tales of pursuit, justice, and revenge. A story of loyalty and betrayal could be sold for a nickel, printed on cheap paper, and passed from hand to hand on trains the agency itself protected. Dime novels and early pulp magazines seized on their name. In those pages, Pinkerton men became the living embodiment of the tireless hunter. Iron-jawed detectives who never slept, never doubted, never missed their shot. Real operations against the Reno Gang or Jesse James were stripped of confusion and failure, turned into clean, heroic arcs where the detective's philosophy always triumphed over the outlaw's defiance. When a raid went wrong in life, it might leave corpses and lawsuits. On the page, it left a stirring speech about law and order and a neatly wrapped ending. There was a quiet irony here. The same agency accused of lying, infiltrating, and breaking strikes was, in print, praised for its honor and loyalty. Sensationalized case files published under Alan Pinkerton's name blurred fact and fiction so thoroughly that readers could not tell where the record ended and the advertisement began. Were they reading history or a recruitment poster? The boundary dissolved, and the legend grew. Hollywood inherited that legend and gave it a new costume. In westerns from the mid-20th century, Pinkertons often rode into frame as suited men from the East, bringing civilization to a raw frontier, or at least claiming to. They stepped off trains in bowler hats and dustless coats. The world was changing in their polished boots, and the old ways were dying in the dust behind them. Sometimes they were righteous lawmen, sometimes they were cold corporate enforcers. But they were always a signal that the days of free-ranging outlaws were numbered. Those films simplified everything. Bloody strike-breaking in Homestead or Pullman rarely appeared on screen. Glamorous chases after bandits did. The agency's role in crushing labor movements, its betrayals, and its hired violence were pushed off stage so that audiences could focus on clean shootouts and noble speeches. Freedom and civilization were reduced to a duel at high noon, rather than a tangled war of money, fear, and power. Over time, most people came to know the Pinkertons not through court records or union testimonies, but through these stories. A story of manhunters chasing a gang feels clear, almost comforting. A story of private armies gunning down workers in the name of profit is harder to cheer for. Which version lingers in memory? Which version is easier to sell on a poster? Then came a new pattern interrupt, modern games and darker films that turned the legend inside out. Instead of unblemished heroes, Pinkerton-style agents became looming antagonists, symbols of a closing frontier and a corrupted order. From its humble beginnings in dime novels to their digital rebirth, the agency's image kept evolving, and in the next chapter, that evolution would reach its most self-aware form yet. That self-aware form arrived on the frontier of a digital world, where the Pinkertons rode again under new names but very old shadows. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the men hounding the Linde gang are not sheriffs or noble marshals. They are Pinkerton-style agents, the living embodiment of a system that never sleeps and never forgives. They are not just chasing criminals. They are escorting an era to its grave. From the very beginning, Milton and Ross are framed as relentless pursuers, appearing at campfires and crime scenes with the same cold certainty that once sent real agents after Jesse James and the Wild Bunch. Their methods echo history: patient surveillance, paid informants, sudden raids. The doomed standoff at Beaver Hollow mirrors earlier manhunts, when Pinkerton pauses rode into canyons and farmhouses and left blood on the walls in the name of order. The game turns those case files into a story of pursuit that feels both cinematic and uncomfortably plausible. Beneath the shootouts, the script is drawing straight from the record. The James Farm raid that killed Jesse's young half-brother, the long campaign against Butch Cassidy's gang, the corporate contracts to guard railroads and banks, all of it feeds into the way the game frames the Linde robberies. Every train Dutch hits, every bank he dreams of taking, sits under the invisible protection of men exactly like Milton's crew. The world was changing, and the Pinkertons, funded by railroads and industrial capital, became the bridge between untamed frontier and boardroom civilization. In the truest sense, they are corporate lawmen sent to crush the last outlaw dreams before they can spread. So the game leans into that reputation. Its agents are not romantic gunslingers. They are bureaucrats with badges, reciting warrants, invoking federal contracts, and threatening families with a flat, practiced tone. They talk about budgets and jurisdictions while arranging ambushes and massacres. That contradiction, paperwork and murder, mirrors the agency's historical role as both detective bureau and private army. The old ways were dying, and these men were paid to make sure the funeral stayed on schedule. This is why the dynamic resonates so strongly. Playing as Arthur or John means inhabiting a doomed outlaw, pinned between loyalty to a failing family and the slow advance of a faceless system. The Pinkerton agents become that system's human face, a reminder that no matter how idealistic Dutch's philosophy sounds around the campfire, the railroads, banks, and politicians have already chosen a different future. Who can outrun a world that has decided there is no more room for them? Yet even this bleak portrayal softens the truth. The real agency was not just hunting bandits. It was infiltrating unions, smashing strikes at Homestead and Pullman, and renting out violence to the highest bidder. If Milton feels ruthless, what happens when the story turns to the men who opened fire on workers instead of outlaws? The irony is almost too neat. An agency once infamous for shooting striking steelworkers and chasing frontier outlaws suddenly found itself aiming at a very different target, a video game. More than a century after Homestead and Butch Cassidy, the Pinkerton name rode back into the public imagination not on horseback, but through Red Dead Redemption 2. By the 21st century, the old detective agency had been reborn as Pinkerton Consulting and Investigations, a corporate security firm with global clients and a carefully managed brand. The days of private armies were gone. The world was changing, and the company wanted to be seen as professional risk managers, not hired guns. Then Rockstar Games released its sprawling Western epic, and two hard-faced agents named Milton and Ross strode onto the screen under the familiar banner of Pinkerton. The past, in the truest sense, refused to stay buried. The modern Pinkerton company filed a legal claim, arguing that Rockstar was trading on its name and imagery without permission. To the corporation, this was not just a story of history, but of trademarks, licensing fees, and corporate identity. They insisted that the use of the Pinkerton badge and repeated references in dialogue could confuse the public, turning a living business into a permanent villain in a digital morality play. In their telling, this was not about gunfights and railroads. It was about brand protection in an age where one blockbuster game could define a reputation for a whole generation. Rockstar's response cut in the opposite direction. The Pinkertons, they argued, were not a private fantasy, but part of the historical record, the living embodiment of a certain kind of 19th century power. The agency had guarded railroads, hunted Jesse James, broken strikes at Homestead and Pullman. It was woven into the fabric of the American West and the rise of corporate civilization. How could a period drama about outlaw gangs and closing frontiers avoid them without betraying the era itself? To Rockstar, using Pinkertons was no different than including Theodore Roosevelt or the Rail Barons, necessary, grounded, and fair game. That clash revealed a deeper irony. From its humble beginnings as Alan Pinkerton's detective bureau, the agency had spent decades crafting its own legend, selling the image of tireless, incorruptible guardians who never sleep. Now, a successor company stood in court trying to fence off that legend, demanding control over how its name appeared in fiction. Once, the Pinkertons had fought their battles in newspapers, dime novels, and wanted posters. Now the battlefield was legal filings and intellectual property. In the end, the storm passed quietly. The suit was reportedly dropped, the case never pushed to a final, defining verdict. Milton and Ross remained in the game, still hounding the Linde gang across rivers, snowfields, and burning towns, while millions of players carried their own impressions of the Pinkertons into the modern world. The agency's legacy, already tangled in loyalty and betrayal, dreams and delusions, became even more contested. Half corporate logo, half historical scar, and now a permanent fixture in pop culture memory. It is a story of a name stretched between three worlds at once, a real history of blood and power, a present-day corporation guarding its image, and a fictional West where outlaws and agents reenact the old struggle between freedom and civilization. And as the next part of this tale turns back to the 19th century, the question lingers. How did that name gain such weight that even a game could spark a legal war over its meaning? The answer lies in the present, not just the past. Because the world was changing in the 19th century, and it has not stopped changing since. The tools are different, the language is smoother, but the story of private power selling protection to those who can afford it has only grown larger. From its humble beginnings, guarding railroads, the Pinkerton model has expanded into a global industry. Today, private security runs from the night guard pacing an empty mall to armored convoys in war zones, from discreet bodyguards and glass towers to international contractors operating alongside regular armies. In the truest sense, it is a shadow infrastructure of force and surveillance, moving through airports, ports, oil fields, and data centers, loyal not to a flag or a town, but to a contract. Some of these firms inherit the Pinkerton mystique directly. Others carry different names, different uniforms, different mission statements. Yet the philosophy is familiar. They promise order in a chaotic world, protection in a dangerous age, certainty in markets built on risk. And, as in the very beginning of this story, that promise comes with a question. Whose order? Whose protection? Whose certainty? Inside corporate towers, the echoes are even sharper. Corporations still hire investigators and security consultants to watch employees, unions, and activists, tracing emails, mapping social media, infiltrating organizing drives with undercover operatives. A meeting that feels safe, a chat that feels private, can be observed, logged, and reported. It is the Homestead playbook rewritten for an age of keycards and encrypted drives, the old ways of labor spying reborn through analytics, cameras, and quiet contracts. When scandals break, the parallels become impossible to ignore. Private military contractors accused of civilian killings in foreign wars, security teams caught tracking environmental groups, intelligence units hired to steal trade secrets from rivals. Each controversy feels like a distant cousin to Pinkerton riflemen on the banks of the Monongahela. Different continents, different targets, the same collision between freedom and civilization, between profit and the lives standing in its way. And the law still chases from behind. Governments regulate, license, and investigate, but the basic dilemma remains. Who watches the watchers when the watchers answer to shareholders and clients rather than citizens and neighbors? Oversight boards and court cases try to draw lines, yet those lines blur in the dark, where contracts are secret, operations deniable, and responsibility easily disowned. The Pinkerton saga becomes more than an antique curiosity. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a private army that became the living embodiment of what happens when money can buy both surveillance and force. The old ways were dying, but the impulse behind them survived, dressing itself in modern jargon and digital tools. As this tale turns back toward the agency's rise and its most infamous battles, another question waits on the horizon. When private power marches with rifles and dossiers, who has the courage and the authority to tell it no? In the truest sense, the Pinkerton story is a story of contradiction, of dreams and delusions, of an idealistic promise that curdled into something far darker. From its humble beginnings in a Chicago barrel factory, one immigrant's faith in law and order gave birth to a machine that would one day fire rifles into crowds of workers and sell intelligence to the highest bidder. The world was changing. So did the work of keeping it in line. From the very beginning, Alan Pinkerton believed in rules. He chased counterfeiters, guarded railroads, and helped shepherd Abraham Lincoln through an alleged assassination plot, presenting himself as the living embodiment of loyal Republican virtue. Yet the same philosophy that made him useful to a frightened young nation, absolute devotion to the client, relentless pursuit of the target, also laid the groundwork for a private power that answered to contracts rather than constitutions. What happens when the badge is owned, not sworn? In that question, the agency reflects something distinctly American: the habit of privatizing public functions whenever profit and fear walk hand in hand. Before there was a formal federal police, the Pinkertons ran nationwide manhunts. Before an organized intelligence community, they sold espionage to railroads and coal companies. At Homestead, they did what an army might do, only for Carnegie Steel. Their detectives guarded trains, broke strikes, infiltrated unions, and, in some cases, practically waged war, all while remaining technically an agency on a company ledger. Their rise mirrors the country's own journey from frontier improvisation to industrial might. In the age of Jesse James and the Reno Gang, they rode as hired lawmen across a fractured landscape where civilization was still an argument, not a fact. By the time of the Pullman strike, those same men were no longer chasing outlaws on horseback. They were escorting scabs through factory gates, turning the tools once used against train robbers against the very workers who ran the trains. Idealism bled into disillusionment, freedom into control, family into hierarchy. Around all this, myth wrapped itself tight. Dime novels painted the agents as heroic bloodhounds of justice. Labor songs recast them as mercenaries and thugs. On screen and in games, they became the faceless pursuers of outlaws and rebels, the cold shadow behind every campfire. Those stories did more than entertain. They taught generations to imagine law and order as something that could be bought, and resistance as something that would always be hunted. So what remains of their legacy? Are the Pinkertons pioneers of modern detective work, early architects of centralized records, surveillance, and forensics? Or are they a warning about what happens when profit and policing fuse into one unblinking eye that never sleeps? As the narrative turns back to their most infamous clashes, with outlaws, with unions, with a nation uneasy about its own conscience, one last question sharpens in the dark. When the myth and the reality finally collide, who actually survives the impact? So the arc circles back on itself, and the myth steps into the light. From its humble beginnings in a quiet Illinois grove to its name echoing through strike lines and dime novels, the Pinkerton Agency becomes a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of private justice colliding with a changing nation. At the very beginning, there is no empire, no private army, only Alan Pinkerton wandering the woods for barrel staves and stumbling onto a counterfeiter's camp. That accidental discovery turns a Cooper into a detective and then into the architect of a new philosophy. That in a world where the railroads and banks move faster than the law, a man can sell order as a service. Contracts with railroads follow, the all-seeing eye logo appears, and We Never Sleep promises a kind of protection that feels, in the truest sense, both reassuring and ominous. The Civil War magnifies that promise and its flaws. Pinkerton agents rush to protect President-elect Abraham Lincoln, spiriting him through Baltimore under cover of darkness after uncovering an alleged assassination plot. For a moment, the agency seems the living embodiment of loyal guardianship, standing between a fragile Union and chaos. Yet when Allen runs Union intelligence, reports are inflated, Confederate strength is misread, and generals make decisions on numbers that belong more to fear than fact. Did they save the president while misleading the war that followed? When the guns fall silent in the East, the West becomes the new theater. The agency chases the Reno Gang, tracks Jesse James, and shadows Butch Cassidy's wild bunch across a frontier where the old ways were dying and the railroad timetable is king. The James Farm raid in 1875, meant to be a decisive strike, ends with a bomb hurled into a house, a boy dead, and a mother maimed. In one night, the supposed defenders of civilization turn, in the public mind, into hired killers. The outlaw gains sympathy. The detective becomes the villain. That pattern hardens in the age of steel and smoke. At Homestead, at Pullman, and in countless lesser-known mills and mines, Pinkerton guns face American workers on their own streets. Men who once hunted train robbers now ride river barges toward locked-out steelworkers, trading rifle fire in scenes that feel less like policing and more like private war. The outrage is immediate. States pass anti-Pinkerton laws. Newspapers spit the name as a curse, and the agency's claim to moral authority cracks. From there, the decline is slow, almost reluctant. Public police forces expand, federal agencies rise, and legislatures move to make sure no private force ever again rivals the Army in size. The Pinkertons retreat into quieter corporate security, background checks, and investigations done behind office doors rather than barricades. Their power fades, but their shadow lingers, a lost soul of the Gilded Age still haunting novels, films, and games. In the end, the agency stands less as a current threat than as a warning, a symbol of what happens when profit, fear, and the promise of order merge into one unblinking eye that never quite closes. And yet, one last question remains. If the badge is private, the gun is for hire, and the world is still chasing its own outlaws, how finished is this story really? So the question hangs there, heavy and unfinished, because in the end, the Pinkerton saga is not just a closed case file. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a private badge held up as the shield of civilization while its shadow fell on the very people that civilization claimed to protect. From the very beginning, the agency sold more than detectives. It sold reassurance to railroad barons terrified of blown bridges, to presidents fearing assassins on dark platforms, to mine owners staring at angry picket lines. The Pinkertons promised order in a world that felt suddenly unmoored. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and here was a company that claimed it could bottle security, put a price tag on it, and send it by train. But order has a cost. Outlaws such as Jesse James and the Wild Bunch were hunted across states, shot down in farmhouses and canyons, their legends trimmed with Pinkerton bullets. Striking steelworkers at Homestead were met on the river by armed guards, and the price of protecting a mill was paid in dead and maimed workers left on the riverbank. In the truest sense, whole families became collateral, wives waking to shattered windows, children learning that the knock at the door could be a subpoena, a spy, or a gun. Even inside the agency, no one walked away clean. Operatives lived in disguises, lied for a living, drifted through saloons and union halls as professional imposters. Some believed in the mission, some believed in the money, and some were simply another lost soul trying to survive in a hardening economy. How many of them went home at night unsure whether they had protected freedom or strangled it a little more? Yet the story is not simple villainy. The same network that infiltrated labor meetings also uncovered real plots, tracked real killers, guarded real trains carrying food and wages through lawless stretches of track. Techniques that feel routine now, systematic interviews, centralized files, coordinated field reports, were innovations then, the living embodiment of a new bureaucratic way of seeing crime and risk. That may be the most unsettling legacy. The Pinkertons faded as a private army, but their philosophy did not. Today, government agencies with three-letter initials, corporate security teams, and data broker algorithms all claim a familiar mandate: safety, stability, protection. The tools have changed from telegraphs and wanted posters to databases and cameras, yet the bargain sounds the same. Trust us with power and sleep easier under our watch. But who is included in that promise of safety? And who stands on the wrong side of the rifle or the lens when capital and fear start paying the bills? When a company can watch more than a government ever could, when a contract can summon force faster than a court, how different is that, really, from a 19th century agency that never slept? The Pinkerton story, from its humble beginnings beside a Chicago barrel to its transformation into legend and warning, lingers because it refuses to resolve. It sits forever on that fault line between freedom and civilization, asking the same question every time a new badge is minted or a new camera goes up. What happens when protection stops serving the public and starts serving whoever can afford the bill? So the story circles back here, to that fault line between protection and profit, between order and obedience, and it asks one last question. Where do legends come from in the first place? From its humble beginnings as a barrel watch in Chicago to a private army feared on picket lines and in mining camps, the Pinkerton name has never just lived in court records. It has lived in imagination. For most people, the first meeting with the agency does not come in a dusty archive or a labor history class. It comes in a game where agents are relentless antagonists, in a film where the badge glints brighter than the truth, in a novel where the detective is the living embodiment of either grim justice or ruthless corporate power. The legend arrives before the ledger. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, is absorbed long before anyone sees a photograph from Homestead or reads a testimony from a wounded steelworker. That is where the real power hides, not just in rifles on a riverbank, but in narratives about what those rifles were doing there. Were they defending civilization or strangling freedom? Were they protecting families or shattering them in the name of a contract? The Pinkertons become a case study in how law, order, and rebellion are framed, sold, and repeated until they feel inevitable. Pattern interrupt, then. Imagine a future historian trying to untangle the mythology of a 21st century security contractor. Drone footage has become their dime novel. Corporate press releases have taken the place of Alan Pinkerton's memoirs. News clips replay the same armored truck at the same protest, each commentator telling a different story of restraint, provocation, or necessary force. Does it really sound so different from a detective agency that once guarded Abraham Lincoln, hunted Jesse James, and then fired into crowds of striking workers on behalf of Carnegie Steel? The world was changing in the 19th century, and the old ways were dying. The same is true now. Private intelligence firms track activists across continents. Security consultants advise tech barons as readily as railroad tycoons once hired Allen's sons. One century's outlaw is another century's whistleblower. One century's celebrated detective is another century's hired gun. How long before those contracts and conflicts harden into legend, and which parts will be conveniently forgotten? So the story turns outward. It asks who gets to be called a defender of order, and who is branded a lost soul or a criminal when the dust settles. Which part of the Pinkerton saga struck hardest? The early idealistic language about protecting railroads, the espionage around Lincoln, the gunfire at Homestead, or the slow, quiet rebranding into just another corporate logo? Do they stand as heroes, villains, or something in between, forever trapped in that gray borderland where freedom and civilization grind against each other? For those who want to keep walking that border, to see what lies behind the badges, bandanas, and headlines, there is more to come. More detectives and outlaws, more families and feuds, more philosophies tested against the hard edge of history. Stay, subscribe, and follow the trail into the next legend, where the myth of the West collides with the records it tried to bury. But the trail of the Pinkertons is not just marked by presidents, railroads, and famous outlaws. Hidden between those headline moments are quieter operations, strange little dramas that reveal what the agency really was in the truest sense. A machine built to chase profit and order through a world that refused to stay neat. Take a jewel theft that barely made the papers outside Chicago. A Fifth Avenue heiress lost a necklace on a Pullman car, diamonds vanishing somewhere between New York and the stockyards. No gunfights, no blown safes, just a locked compartment and a very embarrassed railroad. Pinkerton detectives could have stormed through the train, searched every trunk, dragged every porter into an interrogation room. Instead, one agent went undercover as a nervous jewelry buyer in the city's underworld, another as a disgruntled rail employee in the yard. Over weeks, they quietly mapped out fences, eavesdropped in saloons, and staged a fake sale that tempted the thieves into the open. When the necklace finally resurfaced, it was handed over in a smoky back room to a man who was, unknowingly, paying a Pinkerton for stolen goods. No bullets, just patience, performance, and a philosophy that information was more powerful than any revolver. Yet the same methods that made the agency efficient could turn it into the living embodiment of corporate paranoia. In a lesser-known labor dispute at a Midwestern machine works in the 1890s, management hired Pinkertons not to break skulls, but to break trust. Agents slipped into the union as new hires, sharing beers, trading stories, listening to men talk about wages, rent, and dreams of freedom from endless overtime. One of those agents, confronted with the gap between the official story and the reality on the shop floor, flipped. He began feeding information the other way, warning organizers about planned firings, exposing forged evidence of sabotage, and eventually testifying in public about the company's secret war on its own workforce. The operation backfired so completely that the strike gained national sympathy, and for a moment the word Pinkerton did not just mean mercenary, it meant betrayal, turned back on its paymasters. The reach of the agency did not stop at the border. Long before most citizens imagined crime as an international game, Pinkerton files were crossing oceans. In one case, agents tracked a bank swindler from St. Louis to Montreal, then across the Atlantic to Liverpool. Passports were rare, communication slow, and yet this private network shadowed him through boarding houses, steamship manifests, and telegraphed aliases. In Paris, a local detective almost arrested the Pinkerton man instead of the suspect, mistaking one shadow for another in a city already wary of foreign spies. It was a story of loyalty and pursuit, of civilization extending its reach through private hands, long before federal agencies claimed that role. From its humble beginnings as a one-man watch service to this sprawling, almost invisible web, the agency's history is bigger and stranger than the shootouts and strikes that dominate legend. Each side trail hints at another file, another lost soul, another border crossed in secret. And the deeper those files are opened, the more a question emerges. In chasing law across every line on the map, when did the Pinkertons finally cross a line they could not come back from? The line they crossed on paper soon became the line they crossed in legend, because the moment the Pinkertons stepped out onto the frontier rails, their real history began to braid itself into the same outlaw mythos that shapes the story of the Van der Linde gang. From its humble beginnings, chasing train robbers for the railroads, the agency moved into a role that felt almost cinematic. Pinkerton men hunted Jesse James and the James, younger gang through Missouri backroads, trailed the Reno gang across rail lines, and stalked Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch from Wyoming to South America. The beats are familiar. A charismatic outlaw leader, a tight-knit family of misfits, and behind them, a faceless, relentless force that never sleeps and never forgives. In the game's world, Milton and Ross are that force for Dutch. In the historical record, agents like Charlie Siringo filled the same role for Cassidy and Sundance. Each chase tells a story of two philosophies colliding. The outlaws claim freedom against a rigged civilization, stealing from banks and railroads that feel untouchable. The Pinkertons claim order against chaos, selling protection to the very corporations that are swallowing the West. When Dutch rails against progress and the suits who own the world, he is echoing the same resentment that made Jesse James a folk hero in the 1870s. When Milton tightens the noose around the gang's camps, he is reenacting the dragnet that finally cornered the Wild Bunch's scattered members. Beneath those mirrored pursuits lies a deeper parallel. Both sides are living through a dying era. For the outlaws, the old ways were dying as barbed wire, telegraphs, and rail schedules carved the frontier into property and profit. The world was changing faster than Dutch's speeches could keep up, turning open ranges into fenced-off ledgers. For the Pinkertons, a different death approached. Their age of unregulated private armies peaked when they had more operatives than the U.S. Army, but every bloody strike-breaking job, from Homestead to Pullman, pushed the public and the government toward laws that would finally clip their power. The tragedies mirror each other. Dutch's gang is betrayed from within by Micah, by fear, by Dutch's own delusions. Jesse James falls to a supposed friend. But the agency that once promised to defend the weak against bandits is also betrayed, in the truest sense, by its own success. Its founding creed of protecting railroads and presidents dissolves into corporate mercenary work, its family of agents reduced to a brand name on a contract. Who is the outlaw when the badge itself becomes a weapon? Audiences return to these tales because they are a story of doomed resistance and implacable authority, of dreams that cannot survive the march of civilization. The Van der Linde saga feels so powerful precisely because it stands in that same twilight as the real Pinkertons and the real outlaws. One side sells order, the other sells freedom, and both are losing to a colder, more bureaucratic world. For those drawn in by the Van der Linde parallels, the history behind the emblem is not a side note. It is the living embodiment of how fiction and fact intertwine in the American imagination. The next step is to watch how that emblem survives its own fall, reshaping itself for a new century where the gun on the hip gives way to a different kind of power. The emblem survives, but only just. To understand what it really meant in the truest sense, the story has to leave the gunsmoke and step into the archive, into a quieter world of paper, ink, and competing memories. From the very beginning, the Pinkertons worked hard to control their own legend. Alan Pinkerton wrote book after book, turning his exploits into a story of tireless heroism, clever disguises, and almost supernatural foresight. In his hands, the agency is always noble, always one step ahead, the living embodiment of order in a chaotic civilization. Yet those books were advertisements as much as recollections, meant to win contracts and shape public opinion as the world was changing. Alongside those self-serving memoirs sit agency records, internal reports, and case files, many preserved in scattered collections. They detail robberies foiled, trains guarded, outlaws hunted. But they are written from the inside looking out, defending decisions, justifying violence, turning every dead suspect into a necessary sacrifice. Government reports add another voice, especially after disasters like Homestead and the Pullman strike, when congressional inquiries tried to untangle who ordered what, who fired first, and how a private detective agency became a private army. Then there are the newspapers, a chorus of outrage and applause. One city paper hails the Pinkertons as guardians of property and progress. Another denounces them as hired thugs. Sometimes the same editor changes his tune once the bullets land closer to home. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, even the headlines pick a side. Historians walk into this tangle knowing that Alan Pinkerton's voice is the loudest, but not always the most reliable. Take the famous Baltimore plot, the alleged conspiracy to murder President elect Lincoln in 1861. Pinkerton's own account paints it as a masterstroke of espionage that saved the nation. Yet railroad timetables, independent testimony, and Lincoln's own guarded comments suggest a more ambiguous episode where genuine danger, political theater, and Pinkerton self promotion blur together. Was it a foiled assassination, an exaggerated scare, or both at once? To balance that, labor historians turn to a different archive: union minutes, strike committee letters, workers' memoirs, and the fragile pamphlets handed out at factory gates. In those pages, the Pinkertons are not heroic sleuths but invading forces, breaking strikes, infiltrating meetings, and turning brother against brother. The same raid that appears in a company ledger as protection of property appears in a steelworker's diary as the day the river ran red. Yet this record is incomplete. Some agency files were destroyed in fires, others deliberately purged as laws tightened and reputations soured. Corporate archives remain locked or heavily curated. Whole lives vanish into gaps where no letter survived, no report was filed, no photograph was labeled. The old ways were dying, and with them went evidence that might have confirmed or overturned cherished stories. For the historically minded, this uncertainty is not a weakness but an invitation. Recommended books, scholarly articles, digitized collections, and even raw congressional testimony allow each reader to test the legend, to decide how much of the Pinkerton philosophy was idealistic principle and how much was polished excuse. In a world still wrestling with private power, surveillance, and mercenary force, the next step is to look beyond this single narrative and into the archives themselves, before turning back to see how the agency's power finally met its limits. From that vantage point, the Pinkerton saga stops being a closed chapter and becomes a warning flare on the horizon. It is a story of what happens when the tools of the state, guns, surveillance, intelligence, are handed not to a public bound by law and ballot, but to a private empire bound by contract and profit. From its humble beginnings guarding railroad depots, the agency grew into the living embodiment of concentrated coercive power without meaningful democratic oversight. In the Civil War, that power shielded Abraham Lincoln and gathered intelligence for the Union. In the Gilded Age, the same machinery hunted outlaws on the frontier, then turned its sights on striking steelworkers at Homestead and rail workers at Pullman. The rifles, the dossiers, the undercover operatives did not change, only the paymaster did. That is the first hard lesson. When force is for sale, allegiance is not to a constitution, but to a client list. A detective who protects a president one decade can be the man firing into a crowd of laborers the next. An agency that boasts "we never sleep" can watch over a nation or watch over the boardroom's interests against that nation. In the truest sense, the Pinkertons show how easily idealistic rhetoric about order and civilization can mask a philosophy of private rule. The world was changing then, and the pattern echoes now. Private prisons run cells as revenue streams. Security contractors fight and guard in distant wars, answering first to shareholders. Corporate systems quietly log keystrokes, track delivery routes, and map social networks of employees and consumers. Data becomes a new revolver on the table, pointed or holstered depending on who pays for the report. Is that so different from a ledger of suspected agitators compiled for a steel magnate? Here the story turns closer to home. Who actually provides security in a workplace, a neighborhood, a digital life? Is it a public police force, a city council, a union steward, or a badge that belongs to a multinational firm? And when something goes wrong, a wrongful arrest, a blacklisted organizer, a profile built from harvested data, what court, what hearing, what public process stands between the harmed and the powerful? Sometimes the silence after that question is the loudest evidence of all. Remembering the Pinkertons honestly means resisting the temptation to see only the dashing outlaw chasers or only the brutal strikebreakers. It means holding both the innovations in investigation and the massacres on riverbanks in the same frame. The old ways were dying, but the agency's blend of detective work, infiltration, and armed force helped invent new ways for private interests to govern public life. So when new schemes appear, proposals to outsource policing to tech platforms, to let corporations patrol borders, to replace public archives with proprietary databases, the past offers a measuring stick. Does this disperse power or centralize it? Does it answer to law or to invoices? The next chapter of this story of power, freedom, and justice will not be written only by presidents and magnates. It will be written wherever ordinary lives decide what kind of guardians civilization is willing to hire, and what lines it finally refuses to let them cross. So what is the final verdict on a company that helped guard a president, hunted the era's most dangerous outlaws, and gunned down men on picket lines for the sake of a paycheck? The story of the Pinkerton Detective Agency is not a clean ledger of good on one side and evil on the other. It is a story of ambition and fear, of freedom promised and freedom denied, written in the gray spaces where law, money, and power collide. From its humble beginnings in Chicago in 1850, the agency stepped into a vacuum that the state could not yet fill. Railroads needed protection, banks needed investigators, and a divided nation needed eyes and ears in the shadows. Alan Pinkerton's network guarded Abraham Lincoln on the way to his inauguration, ran Union intelligence in the Civil War, and pioneered national-scale case files, surveillance, and undercover work when public institutions were fragile and fragmented. In the truest sense, they helped invent the modern idea of a professional detective. But the same skills that tracked Jesse James and the Reno Gang were turned, with chilling efficiency, against ordinary workers. The Homestead Strike was not an accident. It was the logical end of a philosophy that treated a private badge as a license to wage private war. Agents stormed river barges under rifle fire, shot into crowds, and left families bleeding in their own homes. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the Pinkertons became the living embodiment of a new kind of hired force. Disciplined, mobile, and loyal not to a constitution, but to a contract. Their greatest crime was not a single raid or botched arrest. It was the normalization of private armies acting as the long arm of corporate will. When a company could summon more armed men than a small town's entire police force, when infiltration of unions became routine, what did law really mean? At that point, who was the outlaw and who was the guardian of civilization? So the Pinkertons are best remembered neither as pure villains nor as misunderstood heroes, but as a warning about what happens when idealistic talk of order and protection merges with profit, when the same organization that shields a president also sells its guns to crush a strike. Good intentions and invoices sharing the same badge will always pull in opposite directions. Eventually, something breaks. Their story belongs with the great American sagas of rise and fall, of dreams turning to delusions, of loyalty curdling into betrayal. From the very beginning to their corporate afterlife as a quiet security brand and a pop culture boogeyman, they mirror a country wrestling with its own hunger for power and its fear of chaos. Some will see more redemption in that arc, others only corruption. Both readings can stand. The question that lingers is not just what the Pinkertons were, but what their descendants might be becoming next, and that answer lies just beyond the edge of this chapter. That chapter closes, but the story does not. The rise, crimes, and collapse of the Pinkerton Detective Agency form a story of power and paranoia, of order sold to the highest bidder, of a private empire that outgrew the men who built it. From its humble beginnings on Chicago rail lines to a modern logo stamped on quiet corporate lobbies, the arc has been traced here from the very beginning to the edge of the present. This has been the full sweep of their legend and their record. Alan Pinkerton, the idealistic abolitionist, the agency that guarded Lincoln and misread Lee, the relentless manhunts for Jesse James and the Wild Bunch, the brutal gunfire at Homestead and Pullman, the slow fade into background security. Rise, crimes, collapse. In the truest sense, it is a cautionary tale about what happens when a nation outsources its conscience and its monopoly on violence. For those who value history told this way, as long-form narrative rather than scattered headlines, this is only the first trail, not the last. Beyond this campfire, other figures wait in the dark. Outlaws who claimed they were fighting for freedom. Corporations that became the living embodiment of unchecked ambition. Movements that tried to drag civilization forward and paid for it in blood. The world was changing in every one of those stories, and the old ways were dying there too. Future rides will follow the gangs the Pinkertons hunted and the companies that hired them. Jesse James and the Reno Gang, Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch, the Coal Wars in West Virginia, the rise of other private empires that learned from Pinkerton's playbook rather than burning it. Each will be taken from its humble beginnings to its final echo, treated not as trivia but as an epic with its own dreams and delusions, its own loyalty and betrayal. Likes and comments here are not just offerings to an unseen algorithm, they are signals that decide which trail gets ridden next. Should the next deep dive follow a lost soul outlaw who thought robbery was a philosophy of freedom? Or a titan of industry who turned detectives into a personal army? Or a labor movement that stood between both and refused to kneel? The reactions beneath this video help choose which door in American history opens first. For those who stay, subscribing is less a button and more a pledge to the journey. A journey through rail yards at midnight and company towns at dawn, through saloons, picket lines, and boardrooms where men planned wars without uniforms. A journey into the hidden corners of American history, where private detectives, hired guns, and desperate workers collided and rewrote the meaning of law and order. This Pinkerton saga is one chapter in that larger saga. The next is already waiting, just beyond the lantern light, where another legend is about to step out of the dark and demand its full story be told. The lantern burns low. The office is quiet. And on the frosted glass of a Chicago door, an ink-black emblem stares back, an unblinking eye over three simple words that once promised order in a restless world. We never sleep. From its humble beginnings in the very beginning of the railroad age, that motto sold more than security. It sold a story of certainty in a country spinning through war, expansion, and industrial hunger. It was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of law and outlaw colliding in the half-light between civilization and chaos. Yet now, with the full weight of this saga behind it, that eye carries something heavier than bravado. It carries the faces of strikers at Homestead, the shadows of men tracking Jesse James through winter fields, the echo of agents riding with Lincoln's secret train in the dark. Picture a Pinkerton office a century ago, closing for the night. Ledger books stacked in neat, uncompromising rows. Wanted posters curling at the corners, a safe shut with a dull, final thud. Badges, polished and worn, hung on hooks beside sweat-stained hats. A clerk douses the lamps, leaving only the glow from the street outside, where horse-drawn wagons rattle past and the world was changing faster than any one agency could control. Inside, case files sleep in their cabinets, not yet evidence in the trial of history, not yet proof in the argument over where protection ends and oppression begins. Those men and women lock the door, step into the chill, and vanish into the crowd, unaware that generations later their emblem will become the living embodiment of private power run amok. Unaware that, in the truest sense, their philosophy of never sleeping will outlive them, slip its physical form, and seep into circuits, lenses, and code. Because the eye did not close, it multiplied. Today, the same hunger that once hired detectives now funds cameras on every corner, databases that remember every crossing, algorithms that predict, profile, and quietly decide. The Pinkertons chase trains and guarded payrolls. Their descendants in spirit guard stock prices and data streams. Then, a man with a notebook trailed a union organizer into a saloon. Now, a server farm silently tracks 1 million workers' keystrokes at once. The old ways were dying, but the urge to watch never did. Is this progress, or just a new costume for an old instinct? When does protection become control? Who gets to decide which lost soul is dangerous, and which corporation deserves a private shield? Every system of power tells itself it is permanent. The Pinkerton Empire once felt that way, backed by railroads, steel, and fear. Yet every empire has a rise, a set of choices, and eventually, a reckoning. Files are opened, stories are told, legends are broken down until the shine is gone and only the questions remain. The unblinking eye fades from the glass, but its reflection lingers in modern screens and headlines. This was one chapter in a story of how freedom, family, and fear are policed from the shadows. The next time a new agency, a new technology, or a new legend steps out of the dark promising safety, remember the motto that echoed through this history. Remember who it served, who it hurt, and who was left outside the circle of its protection. Then carry those questions forward, into the next story, the next headline, the next legend waiting just beyond the lantern light, demanding its full story be told.